Chapter 20 of Vagabonding Down the Andes by Harry A. Franck. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Recording by Blainej, Victoria, British Columbia, Canada. Life in the Bolivian Wilderness, Part 2. If I have inadvertently given the impression that there are no stern laws and rules of personal conduct in Santa Cruz de la Sierra, let me hasten to disavow it as quickly as I was disabused in the matter myself. For it was here that I tarnished my hitherto spotless record for non-arrest in South America. I had come to give Thompson a bundle of American weeklies and was leaving the prison again, when a German who had ridden in from Cochabamba asked me to serve as interpreter while he procured a gun license. As we stepped into the commandancia, an anemic, yellow-skinned, half-Indian youth in uniform shouted in the most insolent tone at his command, "Take off your hats!" The German quickly snatched his close-cropped bullet head bare. But the tone aroused my antagonism in spite of myself. Moreover, a dozen unwashed natives lounged about the miserable mud hall with their hats on. To obey the orders of this class of Latin American officials requires a certain degree of humility, of which, thank God, I have not a trace. At the second command I retorted, "What for?" "In respect for the Bolivian government," shrieked the evil-eyed, ill-smelling official behind the main desk. "But I have no respect whatever for the Bolivian government," I protested, warding off with an elbow the boy soldier who was attempting to snatch the hat from my head. And I stepped out into the street. There I was legally immune. There is no law requiring one to uncover in the streets, even in straight-laced Santa Cruz. But the legal aspect of a case is easily overlooked in Bolivia. The official screamed, "Cabo de la Guardia!" And there poured out upon me 5 boy soldiers with loaded muskets, who, clutching at me like cats, began pushing me back into the prison. I had been long enough a policeman myself to know the folly of resisting arrest, however unjustified. Moreover, there was an entire regiment of these little brown fellows in town, most of whom would be only too happy to give vent to their dislike of gringos. Once I had entered an empty mud room on the first patio, the door was quickly bolted behind me, and I stood looking out through the wooden barred window upon the mud-hole yard, back and forth across which marched the jeering little soldiers and several loungers, grinning at me nastily behind their blackened stumps of teeth. I was in great danger that I would be late for the dinner to which I had been invited at 11. For though my arrest was not legal, those responsible for it had the very simple old Latin American expedient of holding me incommunicado and keeping everyone outside ignorant of my plight. I sat down on the window ledge and fell to reading the Spanish paper edition of the Ernst Haeckel I was so fortunate as to have with me. A half-hour passed. Meanwhile, that dinner was a bare hour away, and formal feasts are not so frequent in tropical Bolivia as to be missed without regret. Luckily, I caught Tommy's eye as he dodged under the eaves to escape a new cloudburst, and, beckoning him to the window, managed to say before he was driven off by 3 soldiers with fixed bayonet, "Go tell the prefect!" The matter never got as far as the prefect. No sooner did the commandante of the prison learn that a man, who only yesterday had been hobnobbing with the supreme chief of the department, had been visited with the indignity of imprisonment, than he hastened to order me set at liberty. Before we leave Santa Cruz, the story of Thompson permits a bit of anticipation. Months later, in far southern Chile, I chanced to pick up a newspaper, among the scant foreign dispatches of which my eye fell upon Bolivia, 14 May, in Santa Cruz de la Sierra, was shot today the criminal Thompson, of English nationality, condemned to the supreme penalty for having assassinated the conductors of money of some local houses. Another half-year passed before there reached me in Brazil local papers and letters giving details. According to these, the judge wept when he read the sentence, but Thompson shook hands with him, telling him that the sentence was just, and that the only criticism he had to offer was that the execution had been so long delayed. As his last favor, he asked that jail conditions be improved, that his friends might be more humanly housed. On his last night he got permission to have a few of these, all jailbirds, to dinner with him, but refused to touch liquor himself, so I shall be able to take in every detail clearly." In the morning he informed friends that he had parents, brothers, and sisters in London, and a wife and son in the United States. To these he had been writing since his arrest that he was engaged in an enterprise that would in time make him rich, if luck was with him. On the evening before his execution he wrote bidding them all farewell, saying he had suddenly contracted a tropical disease the doctors despaired of, and would be dead by the time they got the letter. He was shot at noon, while the bells of the cathedral were striking, so that nothing should be heard outside the prison. In Santa Cruz, Tommy fell victim to that loathsome ailment popularly known as cold feet. An attack of fever and a hazy promise of employment for his trusty trawl were no doubt among the causes. It's probable, too, that he had not entirely lost faith in the attractiveness of sandy hair. But the inoculation was chiefly due to the replies of our inquiries about the road ahead. These were not exactly reassuring. It was characteristic of Tommy, however, that he pretended to be eager to push on while secretly planning to remain behind. There is one of the sand streets of Santa Cruz de la Sierra which does not run to nothing in the surrounding jungle, but dwindles to what is known locally as the Camino de Chiquitos, and pushes on to the Paraguay River some 400 miles distant. Road, in the cruceño sense, however, means anything but a comfortable highway. As usual, the town was scornful of the suggestion that two lone gringos could make the journey on foot. Disheartening stories assailed us of the dangers from snakes and tigers, of the unending pest of insects, of the almost total lack of sleeping places, and even of supplies. For the first week we must carry all food with us. In this rainy season the route was sure to be abound with chest-deep mud holes and miles of swamps. The last 20 leagues, near Paraguay, would be completely inundated and unpassable for months until the waters subsided. Or, if the rains did not come on at their accustomed time, there was as much danger of the country being wholly waterless for long distances. Moreover, beyond the Rio Grande, 8 leagues east of the capital, stretched the notorious Monte Grande, a dense, unbroken forest in which roamed wild Indians given to shooting 6-foot arrows of chonta, or heavy iron black palm, from their 8-foot bows, with such a force that they passed clear through a man at 50 yards. This was said to be quite painful. Nor were these mere idle rumors. We had only to drop in on one of the several men in town to be shown arrows from the bodies of victims, and a sojourning fellow countryman had several relics of the tribe he had had the good fortune to see first while prospecting on the banks of the Guape. Reading Tommy's real opinion of the journey behind his face, I laid plans to continue alone. Experienced travelers asserted that boiled water, a careful diet, a selected medicine kit, waterproofs, a tropical helmet, and a woolen cholera belt for night chills were prime necessities. I had all but 6 of this half-dozen requisites. By choice, I should have turned rural native entirely and worn a straw hat, a breechclout, a pair of leather sandals, and a towel. But life can seldom be reduced to such charming simplicity. 2 things at least were indispensable, a cloth hammock and a mosquitero to hang over it. For the only sleeping place on most of the journey would be that which the traveler carried with him. Then I must hacer tapeque, as they say in Santa Cruz, or pack a bag of rice and some sheets of dried beef, to say nothing of distributing about my person a kodak, revolver, cartridges, and money in various forms of metal. Add to this a few indispensable garments, sealed tins of salt and matches, kitchenette, photographic and writing materials, and the other unavoidable odds and ends for a scantily inhabited 400-mile trip of unknown duration, it would be readily understood why, after mailing the developing tank and even my coat, razors, and accessories, I staggered heavily across town on January 8th to begin the longest single leg of my South American journey. Fortunately, the German who had sought my assistance in the matter of the gun license was bound for at least a few days in the same direction. Heinrich Konatz, born in Karlsruhe, had served the last of 3 years as a conscript in the expedition against the Chinese Boxers, and had since worked as a carpenter in China and California until he had concluded to seek a permanent home as a colonist in some region where population was less numerous. He was largely innocent of geography, spoke habitually a painful cross between his once native tongue and what he fondly fancied was English, with a peppering of Chinese, and knew almost no Spanish. The mule that had carried him from Cochabamba he found it necessary to turn into a pack animal for the tools, materials, and provisions he had purchased in Santa Cruz, and was to continue on foot. He had been placidly making plans to push on alone when rumors in his own tongue suddenly reached him of the Monte Grande and its playful Indians. His first inclination had been to throw up the sponge and return to Cochabamba, but his capital had been greatly reduced and his hotel room was heaped with the supplies sold him by his local fellow countrymen, who would not have taken them back at a fourth of the original cost. He made a virtue of necessity, adding a new rifle to his revolver and shotgun, and offered to find room on the mule for the heavier portion of my baggage in return for the reassurance of my company. It was a brilliant day when I shouldered the German's rifle, my own revolver well oiled and freshly loaded, and led the way out of town. Mud holes, along which we picked our way on rows of whitened skulls of cattle, soon gave place to a great pampa with tall, coarse grass and scattered trees, across which lay a silent sand road so utterly dry that we had already suffered long from thirst when we reached the first well, a mud hole thick with green slime, attesting by its taste to the also visible fact that all the cattle for miles around made it their loafing place and protection from the swarms of flies and insects. Here we not only drank, but filled the German's water bag. When the liquid mud in this gave out, my companion took to lapping up that in the cart ruts and the footprints of cattle along the trail. I held out until I overtook a boy carrying on his head a pailful of guapuru, of which I bought a hatful for a medio. This is a fruit cruelly like a large, luscious cherry in appearance, growing without a stem on the trunk of a gnarly pampa tree. Of a snow-white meat not particularly pleasant to the taste, but a welcome antidote for tropical thirst. Twice during the day we met a train of heavy, crude ox carts roofed with sun-dried ox hides that recalled the prairie schooners of pioneer days, 8 oxen to each, creaking westward with infinite slowness. In the afternoon the forest closed in about us, and we plodded on through deep sand alternating with mud holes. Soon all the woods about us were screaming like a dozen suffragette meetings in full session, and fancying the uproar came from edible wild fowls, I crept in upon them, rifle in hand. To my astonishment, I found a band of small monkeys shrieking together in a huge treetop. Even a monkey steak would not have been unacceptable. I fired into the branches. Instantly there fell, not the wherewithal for a sumptuous evening repast, but the most absolute silence. The little creatures did not flee, however, but each sprang a limb or two higher and watched my slightest movement with brilliant, roving eyes. A qualm came upon me, and I hurried after the German. That night we camped in a clump of trees about a water-hole. The native who pointed out the trail to it did so in a surly, regretful manner, as if he resented the consumption by strangers who should have remained in their own country of a priceless treasure insufficient for home consumption. Down at the bottom of a deep hole in the sand, strongly fenced with split rails, was an irregular puddle barely 4 inches deep, full of fallen leaves, wrigglers, and decayed vegetable matter. Yet from it radiated trails in all directions. The blocks of crude brown sugar we had purchased that morning had melted during the day and smeared everything within reach. The boiled leg of mutton already whispered its condition to the nostrils. The breeze, a slight knoll promised, treacherously died down, and the swarms of insects that sung about us all night frequently struck home, in spite of the close-knit mosquitero that kept us running with sweat until near dawn. Monkeys were already howling in the nearby woods when we pulled on our clothes, wet and sticky, on a soggy morning that soon carried out its promise of rain, and parrots now and then screamed at us in dull weather mood. A heavy shower paused for a new start and became a true jungle deluge. My poncho would have been useless. Besides, it was wrapped in Australian swag fashion around my possessions on the mule. Past experience told me that the only reliable waterproof in the tropics is to let it rain, and dry out again when the opportunity offers. We settled down to splash on indifferently, soaked through and through from hat to shoes, dripping at every seam. The weather was not over-warm either, and only the heaviest moments of the storm dispersed the swarms of ravenous mosquitoes. In dense woods, punctuated with mud holes, a yellow youth in 2 cotton garments overtook us well on in the afternoon, and asked if we would need a pelota. We would. He stopped at a jungle hut some distance beyond and emerged with an entire ox hide, sun-dried and still covered in the long red hair of its original owner, folded in 4 like a sheet of writing paper on his head. For a mile or more he plodded noiselessly behind us. Then suddenly the forest opened out upon the notorious Guape, or Rio Grande, a yellow-brown stream, wide as the lower Connecticut, flowing swiftly northward to join the Mamoré on its journey to the Amazon. We splashed a mile or more along its edge to offset the distance we should be carried downstream before striking a landing opposite. Here 2 men of bleached brown skin, each completely naked but for a palm leaf hat securely tied on, relieved our companion of his load and set about turning it into a boat. These pelotas de cuero, leather balls, are the ferries of all this region, being transportable, whereas a wooden boat left behind would be stolen by the Indios Bravos. Around the edge of the hide were a dozen loopholes through which was threaded a cord that drew it up into the form of a rude tub. To add firmness to this, the hat wearers laid a corduroy of green poles on the bottom. Then they piled our baggage into it, set the German atop, and dragged it down the sloping mud bank into the water, while the youth coaxed the mule into the stream and swam with it for the opposite shore. This seemed load enough and to spare. But when I had fulfilled my duties as official photographer of the expedition, I too was lifted in, as they would no doubt have piled in Tommy also, had he been with us, and away we went, easily 500 pounds, speeding down the racing yellow stream, the naked ferryman first wading, then swimming beside us, clutching the pelota, the gunwales of which were in places by no means an inch above water. Had the none too stout cord broken, the hide would have instantly flattened out and left us, for an all too brief moment, like passengers on the magic carpet of Oriental fairy tales. Before and high above us, where the peloteros coaxed the crazy craft ashore, stretching like a Chinese wall of vegetation further than the eye could follow in either direction, stood an impenetrable forest, the famous Monte Grande, or Great Wilderness of Bolivia. Here was the chief haunt of the wild Indians of the penetrating arrow, a region otherwise uninhabited, through which the road to the Paraguay squeezes its way for hundreds of miles, almost without a shift in direction. We swung our hammocks on the extreme edge of the river, where the breeze promised to blow, and failed of its promise, like most things in Latin America. For though the day was not yet spent, the journey through the Monte Grande is fixed in its itinerary by the 4 garrisons, maintained some 5 leagues apart by the Bolivian government as a theoretical protection against the nomadic Indians. At dusk, a man swam the river with his clothes and possessions in the brim of his hat, and soon afterward the stream began to rise so rapidly that it is doubtful if we could have passed it for several days. Almost at once, in the morning, we met a train of 9 enormous roofed carts of merchandise from Europe by way of Montevideo, each drawn by 8 yoke of gaunt, way-worn oxen, straining hub-deep through the mire at a turtle's pace. The forest crowded them so closely on either hand that we must back into it, as into the shallow niche of an Inca wall, and stand erect and motionless until the train had crawled by, the wilderness bawling and echoing a half hour with the cries of the dozen drivers, with their long goads dodging in and out, knee-deep in mud, among the panting brutes. We met no other person during the day. Travelers to the Monte Grande go always in bands, and the ox drivers stared at us setting out alone, as at gringo madmen. We deployed in campaign formation, our revolvers loose in their holsters. The German marched ahead, closely followed by his affectionate mule, while I brought up the rear with his new Winchester. Mine was the post of honor and most promise, for the Indians of the Monte Grande do not face their intended victims, but spring from behind a tree to shoot the traveler in the back, and dodge back out of sight again. They shoot seated, using the feet to stretch the bow, a slight advantage, in point of time, to their prey. Rumor has it that the tribe is by nature peaceful, but they were long hunted for sport, and are still shot on sight, with no questions asked, and so have come to look upon all travelers as tribal enemies. They are said to be entirely nomadic, to wear nothing but a feather clout, and to bind their limbs in childhood so that the forearms and the leg below the knee become mere bone and sinew, with which they can thrust their way through the spiny undergrowth without pain. This improvement on nature draws the foot out of shape, and the footprint of a savage, showing only the imprint of the heel, the outer edge of the foot, and the crooked big toe, is easily distinguished from that of the ordinary native. However, that was not my lucky day, and I caught not so much as a kodak shot at a feather clout, though I glanced frequently over my shoulder all day through. But if the Indians failed us, there were other visitations to make up for them. Every instant of the day we fought swarms of gnats and mosquitoes. Though the sun rarely got a peep in upon us, its damp, heavy heat kept us half blinded with the salt sweat in our eyes. The road was really a long tunnel through unbroken forest, meeting overhead, into which the thorny undergrowth crowded in spite of the ox-cart traffic. All day long, mud holes, often waist deep for long distances, completely occupied the narrow forest lane. The region being utterly flat, the waters of the rainy season gather in the slightest depression, which passing ox carts plow into a slough beyond description, while the barest suggestion of a stream inundates to a swamp all the surrounding territory. For the first mile we sought, in our inexperience, to tear our way around these through the edge of the forest, but so dense was this that it barred us as effectually as a cactus hedge. We took to wading, now to the knees, now to the waist, sometimes slipping into unseen cart ruts and plunging to the shoulders in noisome slime. It grew monotonous, but so does life under the best of conditions. Moreover, whatever gloom our surroundings created was more than offset by the German. Not that he was gay, nor indeed cheerful under adversity, but the genuine comedian, like an Italian Hamlet, has no inkling of his humor. Constance was his best when he fancied himself most tragic, putting me frequently to excruciating labor to preserve outwardly that solemn gravity that was indispensable to peace between us. He insisted on speaking English. This astounding tongue he had concocted by the simple rule of learning the corresponding English for each German word, and jealously retaining the German grammar and form. All this with so guttural an accent that the hearer could not distinguish lake from leg. Thus I was informed that he put it his hat in, and he set him by a boat the river over. Our snow-white pack mule was of that affectionate nature that craves constant companionship, but the Teuton had no affection to spare, and whenever the animal chanced to stray a yard from the spot in which he had left her, he fell upon the poor brute with a bellow of rage. "Oh, pegot, Mr. Mule! When I don't have to lug myself der load all the San Jose, right away shoot her their head through. Tomorrow, pegot, I bind her der tree on der." At sunset we waded through a barred gate into the Pascana, or tiny natural clearing, of Cañada Larga, the first of the 4 fortines. 5 miserable thatched huts, some without walls and others of open-work poles set upright, were occupied by 8 boyish soldiers in faded rags of khaki and ancient cork helmets of the same color, and a slattern female belonging to the lieutenant. The latter was a haughty fellow of 25, sallow with fever and gaunt from long tropical residence, a graduate of the Bolivian West Point in La Paz, and permanently in command of all the garrisons of the Monte Grande. The others were 2-year conscripts between 19 and 21, assigned to the forts for a year, usually to be forgotten by the government and left there months longer. Our official paper ordered the commander to give us all facilities, wood and water, and to sell us food provided there was any. He waved a hand in a bored tropical way, and 2 of the handsomest children in uniform brought us wood and soon came lugging a huge bucket of water on a pole across their shoulders. What food could he sell us? Not a thing. Some yuccas at least? Senor, we have only half rations of rice for ourselves. But the prefect said we could depend— The prefect, senor, has not sent us any supplies for more than a month. There was nothing left but to cook some of our own rice and charqui, and try to be thankful for even that miserable substitute for food. Its staying powers were slight. Twice during the night I ate a large plate of it cold, and spent much of the time hungry at that. Not that I got up to eat. Much of the night I wandered up and down the Pascana, fighting the mosquitoes and a tiny gnat whose bite was out of all proportion to its size, and which the fine gauze mosquitero, designed for the purpose, by no means kept it out, though it did effectually any breeze that stirred. The lieutenant insisted on sending along a soldier to protect us from the savages. He was a girlish-looking boy of Indian features, armed with an ancient Winchester of broken butt, thick with rust inside and out. Most of the day he lagged far behind, for the sun-dried stretches of road between the swamps and mud-holes hurt even his calloused feet. We tramped unbrokenly for 7 hours, the endless forest walls close on either hand, without sighting another human being, until the jungle opened out slightly on the little Pascana of Tres Cruces. The sergeant in command dragged himself out a few yards to meet us, a rifle shot having warned him of our approach. He had 4 soldiers and a gnat-bitten female. They called the bucketful they brought us from the swamp excellent water. It was clear, to be sure, and a decided improvement on what we had drunk from the mud-holes during the day, the swampy taste not quite overwhelming. But it was lukewarm from lying about under the sun, and had at least 100 tadpoles swimming merrily about in it. One dipped up a cupful, picked out the tadpoles gently but firmly, and forced as much of their vacated bath as possible down the feverish throat. The gnats of Tres Cruces quickly got wind of the arrival of fresh supplies and attacked us in battalions. The previous camp had been gnatless compared to this. Known to the natives as jejenes, they are almost invisible, yet they can bite through a woolen garment or a cloth hammock so effectively that the mosquitoes' puny efforts pass unnoticed in comparison. Wherever they alight, they leave a red spot the size of a mustard seed that itches and burns for days afterwards. What such a host of them had hoped to feed on, had we not unexpectedly turned up, I cannot guess. Surely they were taking long chances of starvation here in the unpeopled wilderness. Under no circumstances did they give us a moment of respite. Even the soldiers, tropical-born and long accustomed to them, ate their supper plate in hand, marching swiftly up and down the parade ground, and striking viciously at themselves with the free hand. We could not leave off fighting them long enough to lift a kettle off the fire, without 100 instantly stinging us in as many distinct spots. In bookless Santa Cruz, I had had the luck to pick up a paper edition of Nietzsche in Spanish. But even in that tongue, the journey through an entire sentence was impossible. I could not write a word or speak a sentence without pausing to slap savagely at some portion of my anatomy. My notes of those days are all short and choppy. A long sentence was impossible. It seemed unbelievable so tiny a thing could bite so. The mosquitero was useless. They could bite through sheet iron. A real dinner would have been a joy, but an hour's relief from these incessant pests would have outdone a week of banquets. One wanted to run and dance and scream, but tired feet forbade. Much as we needed rest, we must keep walking swiftly up and down the Pascana, wondering how long a man could last on charqui and rice, walking day and night. "Oh, Pigot!" cried Conans, attempting in vain to slap himself between the shoulder blades. "In China, Peter Boxer, there is a mosquito. He pinches very much, aber here." Tramping doggedly back and forth in the dusk, I heard the sergeant in his hut singing and apparently happy. I raced to his door. Eureka! Necessity is the mother of invention, even among the uninventive. He was swinging swiftly back and forth in his hammock. I grasped a pack rope and was soon rushing swiftly through the half arc of a circle. The relief was startling. But to work incessantly with the arms was little better than tramping the Pascana. If only the inventor of perpetual motion had not put his invention off so long. The relief from torture quickly made me drowsy. But if the swinging flagged for an instant, the jejenes at once brought me wide awake. Before long, too, a few hardy gnats solved the problem of catching their prey on the fly like experienced hobos. More and more learned the trick until I gave up in despair and took once more to tramping the parade ground. Kept it up, indeed, most of the brilliant, moonlit night. In the morning I found that ants had eaten into decorative fringes on the edges of my leather leggings. Vampire bats had smeared our white mule with her own blood. For a long time I could not make the German understand what had happened to the animal until I dug up out of the depths of memory the word Fledermaus. To watch him pack was always amusing, also a torture. He had learned to do everything in the German style of systemized routine, in which the longest way round is always the shortest way between 2 points, and he knew nothing of efficiency, of that dovetailing of work in such a way as to hasten the process. Instead of lighting a fire first and having his breakfast ready by the time he was dressed, he must be entirely garbed before touching a stick or a pot, and so on, clear through the loading. However often he made up the pack, each detail must be laboriously thought out again, and as he could never think of more than one thing at a time, the operation was endless. Bring him what he needed to load next, and he stared stony-eyed at me, as if wondering why I was trying to disturb his meditations. Though we rose at dawn, we were fortunate to be off before the sun had surmounted the jungle tops. The sergeant insisted, languidly and tropically, on sending one of his armed boys along. We refused. Should anything have happened to the child, such as a sprained ankle in protecting us from the savages, we would never have forgiven ourselves. All day long we tramped due eastward through unbroken forest. Monotonously the swamps and mud holes continued. It would not have been so bad could we have waded all the way barefoot, but the sun-dried stretches between made shoes imperative. Never a patch of clearing, never a sign of human existence, though I still glanced frequently over my shoulder. Never the suggestion of a breeze to temper the heat or to break the ranks of the swarming insects. We threw ourselves face down at any mud-hole or cart rut, gratefully, to drink. It was crawling and it stunk, but anything that can by any stretch of the word be called water is only too welcome in tropical Bolivia. The red-hot poison with which the gnats of days past had inoculated us from head to foot itched murderously. Amateur wilderness travelers have a theory that dope smeared over the body will afford protection in such cases, but it would be a strong concoction indeed that could rout the jejenes of the Monte Grande. The only method is to get bit and heal again, as one gets wet and dries again, or goes astray and finds oneself again. The one absolute rule is, don't scratch. Not to scratch may drive the sufferer mad, but to do so will drive him doubly insane. The swamp water is infectious to any abrasion of the skin, and an open sore is the greatest peril of tropical travel. Let it not be fancied, however, that life was sad even with these drawbacks. The song of the jungle was unbroken, the brilliant sunshine joyful for all its heat. In places the road was completely veiled by clouds of beautiful white butterflies. Sweating freely, there was a spontaneous play of the mental spirits and a sense of splendid physical well-being, not the mind-paralyzing gloom of our northern winters. Up on the high plateau the mind might work as freely, But with this difference, there seemed to be using itself up each period of exultation being followed by the feeling that one was much older, much more worn out, while here there was no such after effects. Though we drank water which in civilization would have caused us to die of cramps within an hour, the constant sweating carried off its ill effects, and though gaunt and gnat-bitten, we both looked the picture of health. The main rule for keeping well in the tropics is to live on the country, to avoid canned food and dissipation, and above all to get plenty of hard exercise and exposure to the elements. Unfortunately, where food is most needed, it is also the most difficult to obtain. A toilsome 18 miles ended at Pozo del Tigre. There was something fetching about the name of this third 14, the Tiger's drinking place. Here were 4 boys, a Cossack post in command of a corporal. Also at last there was something for sale, for someone had planted a patch of corn back in the forest. 2 soldiers brought us choclos and huiro, green corn for ourselves and stalk of the same for the mule. The conscripts preferred coffee and rice in payment, for money is of slight value beyond the Rio Grande, but demanded 5 times what the stuff was worth. It was not sweet corn, and was either half-grown or overripe, but was welcome for all that. We threw the ears into the fire and raked them out to munch what was not entirely burned or still raw. The jejenes made it impossible to hold them over the fire to toast. We squatted so closely over the blaze it all but burned our garments, yet the relief was so great, in spite of the smoke in our eyes, that we all but fell asleep into the fire. The life of these garrisons is dismal in the extreme. The soldiers had absolutely no drill or other fixed duties. In most cases they were too apathetic to plant anything, even to dig a well, however heavily time hung on their hands, preferring to starve on half rations, to choke in the dry season and drink mud in the wet, rather than to exert themselves. Each fort had in the center of the parade ground a crude horizontal bar made of a sapling, but it was used only for a languid moment when utter ennui drove someone to it. The impossibility of teamwork among Latin Americans was never more clearly demonstrated than by the fact that each soldier cooked his own food separately 3 times a day over his own stick fire. There was not faith enough among them even to permit division of labor in bringing firewood. Each set his marmita, a soldier's tin cookpot shaped to fit between the shoulders, on the ends of burning sticks, and sat constantly on his heels beside it, lest it spill over as one of the faggots burned away. The fellows were astonished to learn the use of Y-shaped sticks for hanging their kettles. Toward morning I slept an hour or 2 from utter exhaustion. It was astonishing how one recuperated for all the day ahead with so short a rest. After all, tramping is not like mental labor. A brief repose is all that is necessary. The savages having deceived us for 3 days, we lessened our burdens by fastening rifle and shotgun within quick reach on the mule, though still keeping our revolvers handy. Wild animals are commonly hidden away in the silence of the forest, even in such wildernesses, and rarely cross a path used by man, but they are not always unseen. We were tramping side by side when I pointed excitedly at the narrowing vista of the road ahead. "Deer!" I cried. The German, his mind perhaps on Indians, all but sprang over his mule. Some 200 yards ahead a reddish fawn stood grazing, and fresh meat would have been more acceptable just then than eternal riches. As a 3-year soldier it was surely my companion's place to shoot. Besides, the rifle and cartridges were his. But he marched stolidly forward. With no officer behind to give a stentorian command, his mind refused to work. Every step was increasing the probability of seeing a splendid venison repast for ourselves and for the soldiers ahead, bound away into the trackless forest. "Schusse doch!" I cried in a hoarse whisper. Alas, I had overlooked the preliminary routine of ready, load, aim. The German snatched hastily and blindly at the pack, leveled a gun, and fired. A discharge of bird shot sprinkled the nearby tree trunks, and the startled deer sprang with one leap into the unknown. Conantz had caught up the shotgun instead of the rifle. It must not be gathered, however, that he was not an effective hunter, given prey fitted to his abilities. All this region is noted for its petas, a large land turtle, with the empty charred shells of which any campground is sure to be scattered. During the afternoon, the German actually ran one down. Tied on the pack, it arrived at the fourth and last 14 of the Monte Grande, Guairitos, a larger clearing surrounded by matorrales, or palm tree swamps, and noted for attacks by the savages. The corporal ordered one of his 3 men to prepare the turtle. He split it open with a machete, and, removing all the meat, spitted the liver, the chief delicacy, on a stick, while I set the rest to boiling. When it had cooked for an hour, the addition of a handful of rice and a chip of salty rock made the most savory repast of several days. All through the cooking, Conantz had sat moodily by, fighting clouds of jejenes and smoking furiously for protection. When the meal was ready, he refused to touch it. Evidently turtle is not eaten in the German army. But for once the inner man all but overcame the iron discipline of years. It may have been the smoke that brought tears to his eyes as I fell upon the mess. At any rate, he moved away from the fire and went to tramp gloomily up and down the edge of the Pascana. The thick muscles that in life are so strong that a man cannot pull a leg from its shell by main force, were of a dark red meat, far superior to the finest chicken, unless appetite deceived me, and almost boneless. The comatose condition induced by the feast lasted with only an occasional break all night, so that I slept considerably, even though the gnats roared about my net like a raging sea on a distant cliff-bound coast, and a few hundred managed to gain admittance. A tropical shower was raging when we finished loading. Even the soldiers were in a snarling mood. The going was so slippery that it was painful. For long distances there were no camelones or barriales, as the interminable corduroy-like mud ridges with troughs of slime between them are called. Every step was perilous, until we were splashed and soaked from hat-crown down. After that, a misstep and a sprawl did not matter. Skeletons of oxen were numerous along the way. When the rain ceased, the day remained thick, and the heat was heavy enough to cut with a spade. For long stretches we waded waist-deep through swamps of long green grasses. A few slight pascanas began to break the endless forest. In one of them, and scattered far beyond, we met the first travelers since entering the woods. 4 rusty and mud-plastered wagons, hopelessly mired, others with their several yokes of oxen lying indifferently in water, mud, or on dry land. That afternoon our journey seemed to have come ignominiously to an end. An immense swamp or lake a half-mile wide spread across the trail and far away in both directions into the now thinner forest, the notorious Gariche de Tuna. We attempted to flank it, only to have a faint side path end in the impassable tangles of an even greater swamp. Wandering in this for an hour, we regained the road at last, and putting everything damageable in our hats, and strapping our revolvers about our necks, attempting the crossing. The lake proved only chest deep, but the glue-like mud bottom all but swallowed up the mule, and the pack emerged streaming water from every corner. The sun was getting low, and we sighted a little wooded hill above the sea-flat forest ahead. The road dodged the hillock, however, and we slushed hopelessly on through endless virgin forest. Night was coming on. The insignificance of a man in these primeval woods was appalling. Suddenly, a large, rail-fenced cornfield appeared in a clearing beside the road. But this plunged on again into the wilderness without disclosing any other sign of humanity. Darkness was upon us when a man in white rode out of the gloom ahead, and all but fell from his mule in astonishment. We had passed unseen the branch trail to the scattered hamlet of El Cerro, a score of thatched huts, constituting the first civilian dwelling of man beyond the Rio Grande. End of Life in the Bolivian Wilderness, Part 2. Chapter 21 of Vagabonding Down the Andes by Harry A. Franck. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Recording by Blainej, Victoria, British Columbia, Canada. Skirting the Gran, Chaco, Part 1. We took possession of a galpon, a thatched roof on poles, up in the edge of the jungle. But the anticipated feast was scanty. El Cerro had little to sell and less desire to sell it. Conance was so completely worn out that he threw himself down supperless, without even swinging his hang-net. After a hut-to-hut canvass, I coaxed a cerrito to sell a pound of fresh beef, which, with rice and some little red beans, made such a stew as roused even the German from his stupor. We topped it off with a succulent luxury of an empanizado, a smeary block of crude, dark brown, unpurified sugar, wrapped in leaves, and costing 8 times what it would have in the jungles of North Peru. Of this, we each ate fully a pound, so great was our craving for sweets. Gnats were few in El Cerro, and we slept such a night as seldom comes to the tropical wanderer. 2 of them, for that matter. For a time next morning it looked as if I should have to continue alone, packing my own food and possessions. Conance liked the appearance of the soil round about El Cerro and was half inclined to settle there. We went to discuss the matter with the horseman of the night before, a Spaniard long resident in the region. I acted as interpreter, but in spite of my over-fairness in trying not to influence his plans, the German decided to push on a few days further, chiefly because the best land was largely held by absentee owners. But he insisted on resting for a day. We removed some of the grime of travel and dried out ourselves and possessions, and in the end even fed up, for seeing us by daylight, the people of El Cerro regained confidence and decided that we had more to sell than they had fancied. For 20 centavos a woman brought us the first bucketful of clear water we had seen beyond Santa Cruz. I canvassed the town thoroughly and gleaned some green plantains, 3 eggs, and a sheet of charqui, and finally metamorphized 60 centavos into a spring chicken. Most of the inhabitants were too apathetic to plant anything to break the endless monotony of their rice diet, to say nothing of being too selfish to part with what little they did grow. Their clothing consisted of 2 calico garments and a straw hat for the men and a species of flying night-dress for the women, and their industry was chiefly confined to lying in a hammock in the shade. The women carried their children astride a hip, as in the Orient, the Andean custom of slinging the papoose on the back having entirely disappeared. Each family kept a smudge fire burning just outside the door, as a protection against the jejenes. Rested up and somewhat relieved from the pinch of insects, Conance grew reminiscent and now and then prefaced some characteristically Teutonic anecdote with some such dreamy remark as, "In China, we every day chip more as 200 heads from their boxers off." Beyond El Cerro, the landscape changes. The dense Monte Grande, with its glue-like loam, gives place to a few suggestions of rocks and hills, and the palm trees and frondoso vegetation characteristic of Chiquitos appear. From the Panteon, a bit of a clearing in the jungle, with blackened wooden crosses tied together with jungle creepers, standing over the graves of former residents of El Cerro, we caught a shortcut through somewhat thinner forest to the scattered hamlet of Motocosito, so named for the motoku with which the roofs are thatched. Then we went on all day without another sight of humanity. Now and again the trail undulated over little rocky ridges, where the woods were a bit more open and the danger from wild Indians, if there ever was any, decreased. All day the unshaded tropical sun beat down upon us like molten lead. In the afternoon an enormous palmar, a swamp with a sort of leaf and bulb growth protruding from the water and thickly grown with slender palm trees, opened out on our left, and we should have had to wade for miles chest deep but for a new trail recently cut along the edge of the stony, wooded hills, not always out of reach of the rising waters. Birds, large and small, from herons to noisy parakeets, enlivened the vast, flooded wilderness. About 4 we made out, through the salt sweat in our eyes, the first cattle ranch beyond the Rio Grande, and soon limped into a corral of the Estancia Equito at the foot of a slight knoll. A large 2-story house, in wretched condition, faced a yard overrun with swine and carpeted with the trodden droppings of animals. From the balcony above, a surly Indian Negro female grumpily gave us permission to spend the night where we were, and offered no further assistance. Conantz had dropped on his back in the first patch of shade and could not be stirred, even to unload the mule, which was as well, for when tired out he was hopelessly rattle-brained and apt to be more of an annoyance than assistance. While I piled our possessions into a covered cart out of reach of the militant pigs, he complained of being ill and for the first time accepted some quinine pills. Evidently these are permitted to Kaiser's troops, once they are visibly ailing. The meanness of the estancieros was so Bolivian that they would not even point out a water-hole. I hobbled about for some time without finding anything better than a hog wallow, which dogs, fowls, and the Indian servants used indiscriminately. The breath of the cattle corral drove off the insects somewhat, but the inhabitants, 2- and 4-legged, gave us no peace where I had swung the hammocks after much effort. I coaxed the German to his feet, and with half the load on the mule and half on my own back, led the way a few hundred yards down the road to some abandoned reed and mud shacks. It required a considerable tramp to gather dry wood, and the water, sickly warm and ill-scented, had to be carried a long distance from a swamp completely covered with a weedy bulb. Luckily we had acquired in El Cerro the sister of yesterday's chicken, which, in spite of having jolted on the back all day under the blazing sun, was still half alive. By the time I had chipped off its head, performed the autopsy with a dull machete, and finally sat down to supper, quickly to get up again under the flagellation of insects, black tropical night had fallen, and it was not easy to fetch more water to wash the dishes without falling into the source of supply. The German had not stirred since he had dropped on his back again, except to drink a pail of soup and eat 2 drumsticks and a wing. Then I must fetch another sackful of water, for the sweat of the day, drying on the body, made the gnat-bitten skin so many square inches of torture. Under the circumstances, bathing was no easy task. To have calmly disrobed would have been to be instantly flayed alive by the army of insects. I piled on brush until the flames blazed high, though artificial heat was not exactly required, then threw sand upon them until only a heavy smudge remained. Standing astride this, weeping copiously, mosquitoes and jejenes falling furiously in massed formation upon any patch of skin for an instant unsmoked, I poured the sackful over me, and finally rolled into my hammock in the streaming moonlight between 2 palm trees. Under the mosquitero, the sweat ran in streams along my itching skin. Outside it, millions of insects fought to reach me, not a few succeeding. Bulls wandered by, bellowing in amorous anger. Now and then one paused to sniff at me, pawed the earth savagely, and thrust his snout and horns madly into it. Long rolls of thunder sounded in the east, growing louder and nearer. The flashes of lightning became almost continuous. But the sudden coolness and the fleeing of the insects before the rising wind gave such a relief from torture that I fell quickly asleep. Suddenly, huge raindrops struck me in the face, and before I could snatch down the hammock and race for one of the ruined shacks, the skies were pouring. Then I must go back for my possessions, the damageable portion of which I had taken the precaution to tie in a bundle. Conantz had gone to no such trouble, so that all he owned was scattered over the surrounding country, and such things as we were able to snatch in the flashes of lightning proved in the morning to be those that could best have stood a wetting. We swung our hammocks again in separate shacks, and enjoyed some relief from the heat and insects. But only a corner of the split bamboo roof above me did not leak like a sieve, and that was not sufficient to cover more than half my length. The rain had spoiled a tolerable road, tons of which we carried along in the first fatiguing miles of slipping and sliding with every step. All day we slapped through Terchunkel with no other sound than the swish of our footsteps, as monotonously rhythmical as the ticking of a clock. The mule had transferred her affections to me, perhaps because I did not use a cudgel on her flanks or torture her ears with a stentorial guttural bellow at every step, and no dog ever followed a fond master more closely. Had I climbed a tree, the animal would certainly have got up after me somehow. Conance was therefore advanced to rear guard. The woods being a bit more open, we managed to dodge some of the sloughs by crawling around them, though at the expense of being torn and cut by cactus, wild pineapple leaves, and every known species of thorny tropical undergrowth, so that each day saw us bleeding from a score of superficial lacerations and our clothing rapidly becoming a tissue of tatters. But the mule hated to wet her dainty feet, and must be pushed bodily into each mud-hole and driven through it with loud words and well-aimed clods, even then turning back to follow me through the underbrush. Once, in mid-morning, when I fancied her well across a slough, I heard a crashing in the brush behind me, and turned just in time to see the affectionate animal emerge stark naked from between two trees, the pack stripped completely off her. "Now you'll see what you'll do," cried the German tearfully. "What who did?" I demanded. "Is it any fault of mine that the sex pursues me through thick and thin?" But he was already studying out which knot of the diamond hitch to tackle first in such an emergency. In a way it would have been easier to carry my own bundle than to work for and humor the German so incessantly. A species of tropical madness, familiar to many travelers in the wilds, frequently came upon him. The simple question of whether or not he wished a block to sit on would bring from him a roar of rage, as if he who did not know his wishes in the matter were the king of fools. It was all but impossible to keep up my notes, to say nothing of lifting myself above the surroundings by an occasional page of Nietzsche. If I dared draw out pen or book during a pause in the shade at noonday, steeling myself against the swarming insects, my companion took to looking askance at such occupation. Like most illiterates, meaning by that those who can but have not the habit of reading, he subconsciously resented such action. Perhaps it isn't done in the best of circles in the German army. He had not heard of Nietzsche, but admitted during a cheerful mood that it sounded like a German name. In most cases he quickly found some useless topic of conversation or some chore for me to do, going so far as to fly into an open rage if I ignored these hints. His moods were varied, from the deepest gloom in which he would not answer yes or no to the simplest question. He would grow suddenly bland and garrulous, almost maudlin in his good humor, from no apparent cause. And a bare half hour after some fit of rage, he would be bellowing songs of the fatherland in a voice to call down upon us all the savages of the region, had the peril not been neutralized by a lack of tunefulness tending to produce the opposite effect. The German army ration, he took frequent occasion to specify, consists of exactly so many grains of this, that, and the other, and Konatz considered any man who wanted his supplies in any other proportions a pervert, a weakling, and a rascal. Once we passed a train of ox cars laden with boxes of merchandise marked Via Montevideo en Tránsito para Bolivia, suggesting that the Atlantic was becoming more accessible than the Pacific. Most of them also bore the information Ausfuhrgut, denoting their origin, and all were so old and weather-worn that they seemed to have been months on the road. Indeed, goods for Santa Cruz have been known more than once to be 2 years en route. The government seeks to make this trans-Bolivian route more popular by reducing by 15% the duty on imports by way of Puerto Suarez. Beyond a swamp which we managed only partly to dodge, we met a disorganized band of soldiers, each attended by his chola, who might be, but probably in most cases was not, his wife, crawling painfully toward Santa Cruz with strange assortments of odds and ends on their backs, including the indispensable hammock each and several babies. According to them, the next settlement was so far distant that we gave up hope of reaching it that day and camped in the road, where there was barely room to pile our baggage beside a mud hole for cooking and drinking. Every hint of breeze was cut off by the forest walls high above us, and the night that followed our stew of rice, beans, and charqui was one to be quickly forgotten, if possible. Stripped naked, the sweat ran off me in streams, soaking through the hammock. Into this, the iron-jawed insects swarmed in such masses, in spite of the net, that I was forced to abandon it to them entirely. For a time I tramped up and down the road in the moonlight, but every few steps I stumbled half asleep. I built a fire about my hammock and covered it with sand, but the smudge had little effect on the insects, and made the heat and sweat all the more unendurable, so that I stumbled back and forth in the roadway most of the night. We tramped 4 red-hot hours into Piacoca, all but falling on our faces from sleeplessness, and dodging the worst sloughs only by many a struggle with the jungle. Here in a small open green, backed by rock-faced, wooded hillocks, was the estancia house of a cruceño to whom I had a letter. Only an Indian girl, stupid and filthy beyond words, was there, however, and we got a guinea hen and some boiled yucca at last only by infinite coaxing. At least there was plenty of rich grass for the mule, and a clear running stream in which I bathed and laundered and lay immerged for most of the afternoon in protection from the gnats. In our hammocks under the trees the insects were almost as bad as ever. The only possible relief was to walk swiftly up and down. Had I been alone, I should have pushed on without a stop until I reached a place of rest, but the German was so worn out that not even the pinching of the mosquitoes could stir him up. There was at least a certain curiosity to know how long the human frame could hold up under these unbroken hardships. At dusk 3 youths rode up on saddled steers, the chief means of transportation in these parts. The saddles were not unlike our Texas, and the single leather rein passed from the ring in the nose over the forehead of the animal between the horns. Steers cross deep mud more easily than horses or mules, but are much slower and more easily exhausted, and the width of their flanks makes long riding painful to the hips. The motion is mildly like that of the camel. The natives sat for hours all but motionless, smoking cigarros de chala, cigarettes rolled in corn husks. Between a few gnat-bitten snatches of sleep, I tramped the yard, pausing now and then to squat beside the fire that smudged all night before the native hut, forming a veritable curtain of smoke through which the insects hesitated to pass. The family inside swung in their hammocks all the night through. What secret means the people of this region have to keep their hammocks constantly moving, while to all appearances they are sound asleep, I was never able to learn. More than once I watched them for a long half-hour swinging back and forth with no evident means of propulsion, lying all but on their backs, one bare leg hanging over the edge of the hammock, as if these children of the wilderness had long since solved the problem of perpetual motion that civilization has so far sought in vain. In the morning the tendency to fall down asleep in full march remained. The road was wider and the forest more open, so that the sun beat upon us like an open, puddling furnace. We paused to drink from any cart rut or swamp, and to wash from our eyes the blinding sweat that quickly filled them again. A huge hairy spider now and then ran by underfoot. The natives say they are deadly. We did not halt to investigate. Beyond the breathless corner of the woods where we cooked the last of our beans, we met a welcome sight. A woman with a bundle on her head. Not merely the first traveler since passing the soldiers, but a sign that we were approaching a town. An hour further on we waded a small river, climbed a gentle slope heavy in sand, and found ourselves in a silent hamlet of sandy streets and an enormous grass-grown plaza backed by a stone church, as out of proportion to its surroundings as the Escorial in its village. We had reached at last the famous old town of St. Joseph. The heels of my boots had worn away until they protruded from my ankles like spurs, and I had been forced to chop them off entirely with the machete. My hat had been trampled by the German and the mule during the thunderstorm until it was no longer recognizable. torn, smeared, and bewhiskered with 12 days of jungle travel and mud-hole wading, tattooed from hair to soles with insect arabesques, bleached and faded by sweat and the raging sun, we were no fit sights for a ladies' club as we hobbled out upon the broad plaza. One of the huts facing it was the home and office of the sub-prefect. He, however, was out on his farm, a few miles away, recuperating no doubt from the rush and roar of the city. But all strangers lodge in the monastery. We hobbled in at the door under the 4-story stone tower of that incongruous church, and found ourselves in a former residence of the Jesuits. A traveler asks permission of no one, but goes and takes possession, for the owners are far away and long absent. Now the ancient monastery is in the last stages of dilapidation. Under the arched corredors, backed by noisome ruined pens that were once the vaulted cells of monks, were a score of hammock posts. A half-dozen soldiers and their females occupied some of these. We swung our hammocks in the long space left and picketed the mule out on the grassy plaza. Here and there on the stone walls were crude, life-size drawings of Bolivian boy soldiers shooting Indian, clad in feather clouts and armed with long bows and arrows. 3 arched cells up against the church across the patio had been roughly walled up to serve as the provincial jail. With an earthen floor and a log of wood as bed or bench, its one window protected by hoop-iron bars a girl could have pushed off with one hand. In the back arches lived the cura, a little, dried-up, hair-minded cholo, with the half-dozen of his children not yet old enough to shift for themselves, and their 2 mothers. We learned later that he had 22 recognized children, some of them men of importance in the department. Though he went about pleading poverty and begging from the Indians, the padre owned nearly half the carts that ply the road through San Jose, and no small amount of the surrounding acreage. San Jose de Chiquitos is the capital of a province so named because the early Spaniards found the doors of the native huts so small, as a protection against the gnats and their tribal enemies, that they could only enter them by making themselves chiquitos, tiny, and crawling in on all fours. In 1560, Ñuflo de Chavez ascended the Paraguay River, founded here the original Santa Cruz de la Sierra, the street plan of which may still be imperfectly traced in the jungle a league away at the foot of a rock-faced hill. This first settlement was later removed to its present site, but in 1695 the Jesuits established here, in what is today Bolivian territory, under the name of San Jose, one of their 10 reductions. Not even the ruins of Paraguay, the republic most associated with the memory of the Loyalists, give a better notion of the establishments in which the Indian tribes, converted by the good fathers, were gathered to toil for their safety of their souls and the filling of the coffers of the society in Paris. The mission remains much as it was when the order was expelled from Spanish territory, too isolated to be picked to pieces by visitors, its people too apathetic to make use of its cut stone for their own buildings. These reductions were all alike in plan. A large central square was enclosed by a wall, a ditch, and a stockade, as much to keep the converts from escaping as to protect them from the wild Indians and the mamelucos of Brazil, who came in quest of slaves. An immense church, in the building of which the Pedres made use of their subjects as freely as the pharaohs, stood high above all else. The enormous mission of San Jose, conspicuous in its grandeur amid the solitude of the jungle, as are the monuments of Egypt in their desert setting, was built of brick and stone under Spanish artisans, the 4-story tower bearing the date 1748, and a stone sundial in the center of the patio by which we could still tell the hour, that of 1765. From the summit of the tower, the town below looked like an oasis in a desert of dense green, stretching ocean-wide on every hand. The huge bells were still suspended by ropes of the guembe, a vine used in place of nails in modern constructions, and so strong and durable that it has held these immense masses in place more than 100 years. The tolling of church bells, striking even amid the rumble of civilization, was solemn in the extreme above the utter silence of the trackless selva and the savage tropical solitudes. The evidence is convincing that the first Jesuits to arrive were self-sacrificing idealists, filled with a zeal for converts that made even trickery, decoy Indians, abundance of food, dances, and festivals fair play. Conversion was absurdly simple. Catch an Indian, sprinkle him with holy water, and shut him up within the mission stockade, and his soul was safely on the road to heaven. But once these idealists had gathered the Indians together and won their confidence, they were superseded by astute, hard-headed men of keen business ability, less interested in saving souls than in winning temporal power and earthly riches for their society. The later padres lived like the princes of medieval Europe, surrounded by every luxury the forced labor of the Indians could buy. With virtually a monopoly in trade, having neither wages nor taxes to pay, they were almost wholly free from individual competition. They gave each Indian the education they considered fitting to his place in life, taught as many trades as the society had need of, forbade intercourse with strangers or the learning of the Spanish language, made early marriage compulsory, often mating couples offhand, as did the Incas, and ruled over their subjects sternly, requiring all to rise, eat, work, and sleep in unison at the beating of a bell or drum. In short, they treated the converts like valuable domestic animals. From the cradle to the grave, the Indian lived in complete submission to the padres. In church and at work there was a complete segregation of the sexes under the old regime. But by night all were gathered together, often several families under the roof of a single galpon, with all the degeneration of customs thereby suggested. Thanks to the careful fostering of the race, there is said to have been 100,000 converts in the reductions at the height of the Jesuit power. San Jose is doubly notable historically, for it was here, rumor has it, that the Loyalists were planning to build the capital of a kingdom of their own when they were overtaken by the decree banishing them from Spanish dominions. The last census in Jesuit days credited San Jose with more than 2,000 inhabitants. Today it has barely a fourth as many, drowsing through life in low mud huts scattered carelessly along the sand streets some 3 blocks on all sides of the plaza. Not a few of the original converts of the Jesuits, suddenly regaining their liberty at their expulsion of the padres, went back to the bush, which accounts for the unmistakable signs of European blood in more than one naked savage laid low by a traveler's rifle. Even today such reversions to type are not unknown, and this, with the drain of the rubber fields of the Beni, has done most to reduce the population to its present low ebb. The inhabitants belong to the same general family as the several tribes of wild Indians that attacked travelers on the road across Bolivia, and which are even today the terror of San Jose itself, having more than once assaulted the place with fury. But in the town this Indian blood is commonly mixed with Negro or white, and though Spanish is more general, the Chiquitana tongue, a brand of the Guarani or Tupi of eastern South America, is still spoken. The Chiquitano is in features about the antithesis of our inherited Greek idea of beauty. His head is round, with little or no back to it, the hair thick, jet black, and coarse as a horse's mane, his face wide, all its features bulky, especially the nose, which recalls the Negro, as do also the thick, prominent lips. His eyes are black and rather small, his ears plump and prominent, his teeth generally white and strong, the chin neither prominent nor receding. In color he is light brown, not unlike the Hindu, or the tint of a tan shoe after a month of wear and polish. His body is heavy, thick-set and muscular, though without what we call development of any particular set of muscles. This thick-settedness is even more noticeable in the women than among the men. the former being more erect and high-chested from carrying water jars and other heavy loads on their heads from childhood. The feet are large, with strong, well-separated toes. Their clothing is simple and excellently adapted to the tropics, where the looser the garment, the better the health. The men wear a felt or straw hat and thin cotton jacket and trousers, loose-fitting and generally white in origin, with a wide leather belt containing several pockets and frequently decorated with large silver coins. The women never cover their heads and wear nothing whatever except the tipoi, a single loose gown, thin and white as a nightdress, without sleeves, and with the neck cut as low as possible without danger of losing the garment entirely. In these they frequently march into the stream behind the town, for the inhabitants of this tropical region are far more cleanly than those of the upper plateau, rolling up the garment as the water covers them until it is folded on the head in the form of a turban. As they arise from the bath, they unfold a clean gown so skillfully that the sharpest glance will catch nothing but tipoi and water. As a race, the Chiquitanos are extremely independent and very incommunicative to any than their own people. Like all American aborigines, they show outwardly very little of their thoughts and impressions. Hurrying is utterly unknown to them, though at times they work with a leisurely steadiness. They show few signs of affection, or on the other hand of aversion or anger, being indeed strangely like automatons or lay figures in their deportment. There is far less religion, or at least outward sign of it, in these tropical towns than up on the bleak Andean plateau. Is it because the highlands, drear and mysterious, like Palestine or the wastes of Arabia, bring on a dread that is not felt in the tropics, where nature is, or at least seems, more kindly? When a native dies, he is buried at once. Then his family and friends start a Santa Novena, 9 days of mourning in which they gather together each day to pray and to drink themselves into complete intoxication. He who has given occasion for the festival is looked upon almost as a benefactor. But there is very little hint of the mysticism or worship in these post-mortem antics. In the good old days of Chiquitos, following the expulsion of the Jesuits, the cacique brought each traveler a maid for his service. Today it is the mothers or sisters who offer the guest of the monastery a companion during his stay. Not even Santa Cruz can compare with the former reduction in the complacency of its customs. The Indians of all this region, it seems, were as free and natural in their sexual relations as the ancient Greeks or several other pre-Christian nations, seeing no harm in the indulgence of a natural appetite. And while the Jesuit fathers had a decided influence in other matters, they had little in this respect. Indeed, there is evidence that the padres set an example in this regard quite at variance with their preachings. In San Jose, I discovered that Conance could not speak his mother tongue. We had called on the manager of one of the 2 Belgian houses for information in the matter of homestead colonists in the region, and at every few words my companion spilled over into his homemade English. A dozen times I had to remind him that the manager did not understand that tongue. Here was exactly the type of immigrant Bolivia sadly needs, a man prepared to spend his life in the country, capable of sustained toil, and likely to leave strong children behind him. Yet already the politicians of La Paz had given 3 large syndicates title, almost for nothing, to all the fertile portions of this immense territory, and these had held it shut against settlers who did not accept their terms, which, as I heard them outlined to Conance, virtually made them vassals to the company. Instead of assisting a few fellow countrymen far off here in the wilderness, the manager used all his suave persuasiveness to get my companion's name signed to a contract of benefit only to his own Belgian house, and would in all probability have succeeded had I not been there with counteracting advice in English. These houses are more Jesuitical than their predecessors in exploiting the natives, and their own employees, a former one has added, on reading my notes. The bribery of government officials to obtain immense concessions of land, which they make no effort to develop, is a mere detail of their business methods. They sell it from $200 to 800% increase over buying prices even of Puerto Suarez. A German imitation of a $12 American plow was held at 100 Bolivianos or $40. A roll of barbed wire at 40 Bolivianos. Ordinary shoes as much. A 4-gallon can of kerosene, 20 Bolivianos. Not merely did the Germans take advantage of their virtual monopoly to buy of the natives at a fifth of the just value and sell again at 5 times that, but even their dealings with each other are unprincipled. One episode will stand as typical. A bank failed in La Paz. The government, seeing all the Germans as brothers, notified one of the firms that the bills issued by that bank had become worthless, expecting one house to warn the other. Instead, the manager gathered together all the worthless billetes in his possession and sent them, one at a time by natives, to the rival house, with orders to make some small purchase and bring back the change in good money. Barter is the chief form of commerce in all this region. We chanced to be chattering with the manager of a Belgian house in San Jose when the wobbly-minded old cura came in with a long document written on the firm's stationery. It proved to be the certificate of baptism of a daughter recently born to the manager, whose housekeeper had insisted on this formality. After much chaffering, the priest was at last beaten down to 3 Bolivianos for his divine services. "Caramba!" cried the German in pretended anger. "If you're going to mulct me this way every time, I'll discharge my housekeeper and bring you no more to baptize. And what are you going to take for these 3 billetes?" he went on. The priest ran his dull eyes around the shelves packed with all manner of cheap imports until they fell upon a long array of bottles. Then he glanced back at the manager, who was at that moment offering him a cigarette. "Pues, señor," mumbled the old ecclesiastical as he accepted a light. "I wonder if you have one real good wine, proper to say mass with." "Como no?" cried the German, in his throaty but self-confident Spanish. "There's a splendid wine, just the thing for mass, worth 5 Bolivianos even in Europe, but," with a wink at Conance and myself, "to you, as my compadre as well as priest, I'll make it 3. The cura accepted the exchange and wandered back to the monastery with the bottle under his arm. To judge from the condition he was in when we returned to our lodging, he said at least half a dozen masses that very evening. We were lolling luxuriously in our hammocks one morning when a man in a sun-faded straw hat, cotton jacket and trousers, a long lack of shave, and feet that had never known the restraint of shoes, wandered into the compound and asked Conance if he spoke English. The latter, full of the self-confidence of his race, had already misinformed the newcomer in the affirmative when I drew his attention. There was not a hair of the man's head that did not cry native, yet he spoke my own tongue rapidly, with only the intangible hint of a foreign accent. "Where did you learn English?" I yawned. "Why, I'm an American," came the startled answer. "My name is Jim Powell. We was born in Texas." He went on without urging. "I don't remember what place, and when I was small, Pa and Ma, they went away with 5 of us children because North America was fixing to fight. I don't know what country they was aiming to fight, but Pa didn't want to. And so we sailed across the ocean to Bolivia. The other 7 children was born in Chiquitos, and finally Pa, he up and died last year. Ma, she's living out to San Antonio, and the rest is mostly scattered around. One of the girls married to a judge in Santa Cruz, and the others is on the rocks." His language was that of the white trash of our southern states, but was academic compared to the illiterate brogue of his brother, Hughie, who arrived soon after him. The latter had come to Bolivia so young that Spanish and Chiquitana were his native tongues. He was a bullock driver for a native owning several carts, and had recently been released from 8 months in the prison of Santa Cruz at the cost of all he owned. "Just 'cause I killed a feller that was monkeying with one of my women." Accustomed as we are to transplanting foreigners of all nationalities in our own country, it was a distinct shock to come upon a Bolivianized American. Such atavism brought the reflection that civilization is at best a weak and artificial thing. So completely native had the pair become that the natives themselves never thought of them as foreigners. Hughty was soon to leave for the Paraguay River with a train of carts, and invited us to go along, pretending, native fashion, that he was in charge of the expedition, of which in reality he was a mere peon. When the time set came, he wandered into the monastery to say that we should start the following night. "If that there mozo finds that there bull run away," or if not, the next night. Hughty was a true Bolivian in putting his trust chiefly in tomorrow. End of Skirting the Gran Chaco, Part 1. Chapter 21 of Vagabonding Down the Andes by Harry A. Franck. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Recording by Blainej, Victoria, British Columbia, Canada. Skirting the Gran Chaco, Part 2. The shadow across the Jesuit sundial was exactly horizontal when, refreshed by our 4 long gnatless days and nights in San Jose, we pushed on along a road that stretches like a tunnel through the greenery. Konatz had decided to travel a few days further eastward. The road was of sand that drunk up the rains quickly, but thirst was correspondingly worse. Jejenes were fewer, though swarms of swamp flies added their annoyance. The danger of savages was less than in the Monte Grande. On the other hand, tigers, as the natives called the jaguar, were said to be plentiful. The mosquitero protected us from these, however, were there any protection needed, when sleeping in the wilderness, for the animal is never known to attack unless it can see the head of its victim. We were soon splashing again waist-deep through swamps, and often wading as laboriously through deep sand between them. Beyond the palm-thatched hamlet of Dolores, where we saw our first wild ostriches, the country grew more open with scrub trees, the way strewn with appetizing petas, or land turtles, the hollow charred shells of which marked more than one camping ground of former travelers. We should have reached the ranch of an American off the main road on the second day, had not the German given out at Las Taperas, a cluster of 3 huts at the forking of the ways. We camped under a heavily loaded lemon tree beside a swampy lake backed far off by a blue range of low hills. From this flowed a clear little stream in which I lay most of the afternoon, with only my nose and hands out of the water, and finished the volume of Nietzsche, to the disgust of the German, who did not believe in washing all over their body. In the morning we struck off by the faint trail around the lake. The day was brilliant, and the going pleasant enough to be enjoyed amid my own meditations. I let the German and his animal draw on ahead until they were lost to view in the placid Chiquitano landscape. At Las Taperas we had bought for 20 cents a whole bunch of the fat little silky bananas of the region and hung them on the pack. As I plodded on through a low scrub forest and a tough and wiry grass knee-high, hunger gradually intruded upon my dreams, and almost at the instant it grew tangible, a fresh banana appeared in the trail before me. After that they were as nicely proportioned to my requirements as manna to the Israelites in a not wholly dissimilar wilderness. But what had become of Konatz? Hour after hour passed without a sign of him. He was not accustomed to lead the way for so prolonged a period. I pushed on more rapidly, not entirely free from visions of savages falling upon him. The sun stood high overhead, casting down its rays like the contents of an overturned melting pot, when I caught sight of him at last some distance beyond. He lay, panting and dripping in the scant shade of a bush, while the mule stood tied to another, eyeing him suspiciously. It was a full minute before he gathered breath to relieve my anxiety. "Oh, you blank mule!" he gasped, shaking his fist at the animal so savagely that it all but tore itself loose. "Right away now I shoot you their head through you!" Expurgated of its adjectives, the story, during which I was forced to retain a deep solemnity, was that the mule, after having been beaten and kicked during all the loading that morning, had suddenly taken fright when the German started up from a log on which he had rested for a moment and had run away. For hours the angry Teuton had pursued the animal, trailing her by the clue of bananas she had dropped at intervals for my benefit, until, no doubt, frightened to find herself alone in the wilderness. "She come walking back against me, just like a woman's bigot. Run away and then go sneaking back because she have to have her home under master." Beyond the rancho of Pablo Rojo, the pampa gave place to monte, dense, tangled growth not tall enough to shade us from the blazing afternoon sun, yet high enough to cut us off in the trough-like trail from every breath of breeze, until our tongues and throats went parched and charqui dry. And the red-hot sand sifted in through the holes in my shoes and burned my toes. Conant's could only be coaxed along a mile at a time, between which he lay like a log in any patch of shade to be found. Luckily the sun was still above the horizon when the endless jungle was enlivened by the welcome sight of a thatched house framed in corn and banana fields, and backed by slight wooded ridges. About the gate, toward which we tore our way through jungle grass shoulder high, were toiling 3 men in long uncut hair and beards, barefoot in their leather ahotas, and wearing the customary chiquitano garb of too thin and faded garments topped by sun-faded hats of local weave. To my astonishment, all 3 turned out to be Americans. Henry Halsey, whose welcome was as genuine as any I received in South America, though less expressed in words than deeds, was the owner of this wilderness estate. His employees were Chris and George Powell, younger brothers of the pair we had met in San Jose. Halsey was a Virginian whose career had ranged from teaching country school to mining in Zaruma and Cerro de Pasco. The altitude bothered him, and he had drifted to Paraguay, only to find too much government, and to push on into this wilderness, as far from the world as a man can easily get. Not because the government of Bolivia is an improvement on that of Paraguay, but because its tentacles rarely reach so far into the wilds he had prospered. He had all but come to grief at the outset, however. Barely had he chosen a knoll on which to build his hut when he was bitten by a small viper that swelled one leg to thrice its natural size and left him half paralyzed. For 4 days he could not move from where he lay, and only by good fortune had he water within reach, for no other human being appeared until long after his recovery. Now, with a native wife and child, as well as his peons, he was in no danger of repeating the experience. With American energy he had cleared of the primeval tropical forest a large space that now waved with cornfields and sugarcane, with bananas and productive ground vines, and had built a large house in the native style and a distillery to turn his sugarcane into value, while his cattle spread over a broad region in which he had no neighbor to dispute his sway. His chief problem was to get peons, for as often as a native was named sub-prefect of the district, he rounded up all the laborers for many miles around and forced them to work on his own estate. Thus Halsey was reduced to the intermittent assistance of Chris and George. These Bolivian-born sons of the Texan who didn't aim to fight were as truly peons as the lowest of the natives. They were subject to the same slavery that prevails in all of the region, hiring themselves out for an advance and getting ever more deeply into debt to their employer. Chris was just then working out a rifle, and his brother a saddle steer. They had all the diffidence of the native peon, the same point of view, the same loose habits, spoke English only when forced to, lamely and without self-confidence, ending every sentence with an appealing, "Ain't that right, Ma?" to their mother. The latter was strikingly typical of the erosion of customs, a poor white of our South grafted upon the life of tropical Bolivia, completely illiterate, barefoot, bedraggled as any native woman, whom she went one better by insistently chewing tobacco. She had solely succumbed to her environment and spoke fluently one of the most atrocious imitations of Spanish it has ever been my fortune to hear in a long experience with all grades of that tongue. Here we made up royally for all the hungry days behind us. The products of Halsey's exotic industry ranged all the way from fowls to milk. Huge bowls of real honest-to-goodness milk, unboiled, unspoiled in any Latin American way, lacking only bread, which could not be had in these wilds at $1 a nibble. Its role was filled by cold boiled squash or plantains fried in lard. The craving for sweets, I found, was no personal weakness. Halsey ate huge quantities of sugar, which he refined by the primitive method of covering it with a layer of mud, sprinkling it on every possible dish and often munching it like candy. The longing for fats or grease, commonly supposed to be chiefly confined to the Arctic regions, was also extraordinary in this climate. So great was the demand for lard that it sold at 50 cents a pound. The axle grease supplied by the owners of bullocks' carts was mixed with soap to prevent the peon drivers from eating it. Among the children of the region, dirt eating, due to some morbid condition of the stomach, is almost universal, frequently resulting in death unless the vigilance of parents is constant. The majority are chalky white, weak and sickly, with enormous protruding bellies. One of Halsey's sources of income was the carting of salt from the Salinas, shallow lakes some days to the south, around the shores of which it gathers in large quantities, to the neighboring hamlet of San Juan, where it sold at 25 Bolivianos a hundredweight. The region was well stocked with deer. Wild cattle belonged to whoever shot them. Jaguars were not hard to find, and antas were so numerous that he shot at least one a week to feed his hogs. This stout, bulky animal, largest of the South American fauna, known to us as the tapir, lives in the dense thickets near streams or water holes in which it bathes by moonlight or in the gray of dawn. The experienced hunter has little difficulty in waylaying the anta, since it always follows the same path to and from the water. The Bolivian variety is about the size of a yearling calf, with short legs and long, flexible porcine snout. Its skin, excellent for making of harness, is so tough that it dashes with impunity through the densest spiny thickets, often tearing from its back by this means its chief enemy, the jaguar. Caught young, the anta becomes tame as a puppy, following its master with marked devotion. 4 days I swung my hammock under a great tree before Halsey's door, reading belated magazines of the lightweight order, the neurotic artificiality of which seemed particularly ridiculous against this background of primitive nature, as the complexity of life in great cities stood out by contrast to the simple ways of the region. Lounging in the tropical shade, it was easy to understand why men so often settle down in the tropics and let the world drift on without them, easy to lose the feeling that life is short and fleeting, that one will be a long time dead and must grasp existence as it passes. The day after our arrival, Conance had fallen victim to chills and fever. My regret was tempered by the memory of many a vain struggle to get him to take a daily dose of quinine. When he recovered, which did not promise to be soon, he planned to explore the region around about for a spot on which to settle. I took leave of my fellow men on one of the last mornings of January and struck off alone. That day's experience emphasized the difference between trackless jungle and even the poorest of roads. Some 12 miles separated Halsey's estate from the traveled trail. The faint path through wiry grasses and low brush, which he had pointed out to me, died out even sooner than I had feared. I pushed on in the direction I knew I must go, south and a shade east. A wooded bluff standing above the jungle landscape like the Irish coast from the sea gave an objective point. It was on the summit of this that Thompson and his fellow assassin had planted in vain their ill-gotten gold. In just such jungle as that about me, they had wandered starved and choking for days. Somewhere in this sea of vegetation lay the sun-bleached and vulture-picked bones of the more fortunate of the pair. To keep a due course in the trackless wilderness is not so easy as to set it. I was soon among heavier undergrowth that cut down my progress like a headwind that of a windjammer, then in head-high jungle that made every step a struggle, then in full forest with the densest undergrowth snatching, clinging, tearing at me for all the world like living beings determined to stop my advance at any cost. Vines enwrapped me, head, chest, waist, and feet at every step. Thorns and brambles gashed and tore my sweat-rotted clothing. Leaves of wild pineapple laid bare my bleeding knees. The jungle reached forth and snatched a sleeve from my shirt, slashed my hands, broke my bootlaces, poured blinding sweat into my eyes, and treacherously tripped me up so that I smashed headlong into masses of vegetation where who knew what might be sleeping or lurking. The scent of wild animals was pungent. Now and then I fell into their recent lairs or signs of their passing. Every plunge left me so breathless from the incessant struggle that I was several minutes gathering strength to crawl to my feet and tear my way onward. All day I fought nature hand to hand, with growing conviction that I should still be struggling when night came upon me. The sun beat piteously down into the breathless tangle. Once, when thirst seemed no longer endurable, I had broken out upon a small swamp and thrown myself face down to drink it half dry. From it radiated the paths of wild animals, and every inch of the wet sand was marked with their footprints, as fresh as if they had that moment passed. I recognized those of deer, the anta, the cat-clawed jaguar, and those of at least a score of smaller species were plainly visible. Beyond the waist-deep swamp, the waterless jungle was even thicker. The blue headland of Ipias had long since been lost to view, and I found that I was indeed going around in a circle, like the heroes of fiction, until I drew out my compass and insisted that nature let me through the way it indicated. Hunger was completely routed by a thirst like a raging furnace within me. Frequently I brought up against thorn-bristling thickets so dense that further progress seemed impossible, and must tear my way back and forth as along some fortress wall, seeking a weak spot in the impregnable density. Then all at once, toward sunset, when I had concluded I was hopelessly lost, I fell suddenly out of the jungle into a sandy road. Fell indeed on hands and knees, for the way was worn several feet deep into the soft soil. An hour along it brought me to the Pascana of Ipias, uninhabited, yet, like all these rare natural clearings on the Trans-Bolivian route, so important as to have its name solemnly engraved on the map of the Republic. This was the scene of what Thompson had called our stunt. In a bit of space scooped out of the jungle were the 6 weather-blackened wooden crosses of the victims, the largest crudely carved with the names of all. That of the German Confederate, with its cross-piece at a sharp angle, the natives of the region apparently resenting his claim to full Christian burial. Beyond the clear little stream that makes Ipias a favorite camping ground, 4 ox carts were preparing for the customary night journey after a day of rest and grazing. One of the barefoot drivers under command of a cholo astride a saddle steer proved to be Hughie Powell. I climbed into his wagon and stretched out on the great balls of rubber from the Blainej with which it was loaded. Each cart was drawn by 20 oxen, gaunt, reddish, long-horned animals that seemed patience done in flesh and bone. Their pace averaged perhaps 2 miles an hour. Now and then, Hughie, like the other drivers, sprang noiselessly into the sand and, racing ahead, lashed each yoke in turn with insulting words of encouragement. And the entire team crowded into one of the close-set jungle walls until the massive 2-wheeled cart was dragged over small trees and head-high bushes at a slight acceleration of pace. A dozen strange cries were used in urging the phlegmatic animals forward. When a halt was ordered, the driver sprang to the ground and ran alongside them, voicing a long, soothing wail of peculiarly mournful timbre that often lasted a full minute. So. Once in the thick black night, the train halted to boil rice and make tea of a willow-like jungle leaf, then dragged drowsily on. At daylight we broke out into the Pascana of Motococito, where the animals were turned loose to graze for the day. Each pair still yoked together by a beam that was almost a log, fastened across the front of their horns with rawhide thongs, while the peons swung their hammocks under an ancient thatched roof on poles. We had made 4 leagues, or a scant 12 miles, during the night. I made my way to the home of Don Cupertino nearby, for no traveler across Bolivia misses the opportunity of at least one meal with this best-hearted of Bolivians. Outwardly ugly, He was a man of fascinating personality, before whom one could sit for hours listening to well-told anecdotes, frequently emphasized in his excitement by the snapping of his long forefinger, and marveling at the grasp of mind of a man who has never emerged from this inland wilderness. So great was his magnetism that he had imposed on all those about him a degree of human kindness and common decency rare in the region. The education of this corner of the Republic, wholly neglected by the government, he had taken upon himself. He had turned one of his thatched buildings into a school for the children of whatever caste roundabout, and drafted as schoolmaster a Spanish shoemaker who had drifted in upon him. Motococito is frequently favored with attacks by the wild Indians, and not the least dramatic of Don Cupertino's stories was that of the routing of a band of Los Barbaros the night before. The pace of the ox carts was so slow that I pushed on alone. The sky was incessantly growling off to the southwest. Banks of jet-black clouds frequently wiped out the brilliant sun, and many a roaring tropical deluge set me slipping and sliding at every step. Swamps of varying length and depth continued monotonously to intrude, until I became amphibious, with water almost my natural element. Where the road forked one afternoon, I took the fainter left-hand trail for a side trip to the town of Santiago de Chiquitos. The rumor was persistent that Americanos lived there. Moreover, it was said to be situated on a ridge unknown to insects. The heights to be surmounted were not piled into the sky ahead as in the Andes. I knew I was rising only by the changing character of soil and woods, the former increasing in rocky sandstone formations, the latter more open, with diminishing undergrowth. After the first few miles up, the forest opened out now and then on little grassy pampas, with V-shaped gaps in the wooded hills through which one could look back upon tropical Bolivia, spreading away sea-flat, humid blue to infinity in every direction, with a vast sense of relief after weeks of never seeing the woods for the trees that had shut me in. The trail split at last into several branches. The one I took at random led me to a thatched hut, then suddenly broke out upon the grassy plaza of a great or a tiny town, according to the point of view and the immediate previous experience. A native lolling in a hammock answered my question with a "Si, ay," in the impersonal monotone common to the tropics, languidly nodding toward one of the huts facing the plaza. Jungle-worn and all but shoeless, my reddened knees protruding through the remnants of my breeches, my shirt lacking a sleeve, and otherwise mutilated beyond recognition, unkempt and sun-scorched, showing many a patch of my insect-arabesqued hide, my face bristling with 4 razorless weeks, unquestionably the most disreputable sight in all that disreputable region, a hunger like the old man of the sea riding my shoulders, I strode across to the building indicated and paused in the doorway. Inside, seated about a snow-white table, backed by a butler of African dignity, sat 5 gringos in speckless white, dipping their soup noiselessly and without haste, with a calm backward motion. Santiago was the headquarters and place of recuperation of the employees of the Farquhar Syndicate, engaged in surveying the 1,500 square leagues of territory recently conceded the company at a nominal price. There I slept in the first bed since Cochabamba. The chickens that died for us were countless. The inevitable phonograph was in full evidence. There were lamps to read by even at night, and books to read by them. When the sun touched the jungle sea to the west, Los Americanos strolled homeward from the office, pausing to play ball until dark, with real gloves, but picking green oranges from the plaza trees as often as they needed a new ball. Great bands of deep green parakeets flew by high overhead, screaming and gossiping deafeningly, but with no suggestion of stopping in a place so high and cold. From this mountain top, the sunsets across the humid blue, flat jungle were indescribable, particularly after a rainy day. The enormous conflagrations blazed for a brief time across all the western world, faded to red, to pink, then into the steel gray of a tropical evening, The distant hills turned from deep blue to purple, banks of white clouds floating up out of the wilderness below. The sky above faded through all the shades of pink to lilac and to purple, until even the flecks of clouds tinged with the last reflected rays were wiped out entirely. At night, looking south, we could see the fires of the wild Indians of the Gran Chaco. Besides the Anglo-Saxons, there were the managers of 2 Belgian houses, the only stores for some 100 miles around. Mere thatched huts like the rest, with no distinguishing signs, an odd German or two, an Argentino who wore shoes, and the rest were barefoot natives, except for an occasional sun-faded passerby. Like San Jose, Santiago de Chiquitos, set almost exactly in the geographical center of South America, was a reduction of the Jesuits, with more than 1,500 inhabitants at the time of their expulsion. Today it is a sleepy little hamlet of some 2 streets of 1-story huts among gentle and frondoso hills, with a constant breeze and no insects, lolling through an easy, barefoot, loose-gowned existence, chiefly in hammocks. Coffee bushes filled every backyard, the coffee of Santiago being famous through all Chiquitos. A languid commerce in cattle, sugar, and alcohol is carried on intermittently. The region round about is rich in timber. High above all else, a wonderfully beautiful palm tree stands out against the cerulean sky. The inhabitants retain much of the customs bequeathed them by the Jesuits. Only a wooden church was built here, with 4 bells in a wooden tower on legs some distance from the main building. Into this an Indian climbs several times a day, and more often by night, to make life hideous. Why the Loyalists were so fond of the continual hammering of these instruments of torture was a mystery to me at the time, but in the library of Ascension I ran across an old volume that explained the matter. The writer, a European member of the Brotherhood, visiting a reduction, asked the superior why the padres saw fit to keep themselves awake most of the night for no apparent reason. The Jesuit answered, "Brother, we keep our faithful flock toiling all day in the fields. After the evening meal they drop at once to sleep without remembering their marital duties. Their first fatigue worn off, we remind them of those duties now and then during the night, waking them up with the noise of drums and bells, to the end that the succeeding generation may be larger, to the glorification of the sacred church and our holy society." And to think that I had fancied the jangling of church bells all down the length of the Andes to be a mere caprice of the Holy Fathers. The fiestas of Jesuit days are religiously preserved. Several nights we were kept awake by the monotonous, heathenish beating of a drum, often accompanied by a shrill fife. By day, to the music of these, most of the population marched round and round the town, holding hands and swinging them high before and behind them in a kind of shuffle and whirl on their bare feet in the silent sand streets, getting ever drunker on chicha of maize or the stronger toté. They danced also the chobena to the accompaniment of the manais, a hollow calabash with seeds inside it. There was no resident priest, but an old Indian who had assisted the former cura conducted a service each Sunday, always ending it with a debauch that hung over into the middle of the week. There is one custom, however, which even the Jesuits could not bequeath them, that of industry. In the olden days the entire population was sent to work each morning with drums, prayers, and processions. Today only the processions, prayers, and drums remain. As in all Chiquitos, the women and girls of Santiago, chiefly Indian in blood, with now and then a trace of the Negro, solidly built as an anta, wear only the loose tipoy. Their customs are, if possible, even more easy-going than those of San Jose. Yet they are by no means forward, being rather bashful indeed, with little sense of wrongdoing, and are said to yield more easily to blandishments and trinkets than to money. The former priest demanded fabulous sums for his services, which is no doubt one of the reasons why virtually none, even of the best families, are married. The moral attitude of the place may most easily be gauged by an episode that occurred during my stay. A shoemaker living in the other half of the thatched hut occupied by Los Americanos, learned that the young woman who passed as his wife had yielded to the entreaties of one of the foreigners. He beat the girl until her cries could be heard in the office across the broad plaza. But when, next day, he met the offending American, he bowed respectfully with a polite "Buenos dias, señor, y cómo está usted?" The distance from Santa Cruz de la Sierra to the Paraguay turned out to be 135 leagues, something over 400 miles, divided as follows: Santa Cruz to San Jose, 56 leagues, to Santiago, 32, to Santa Ana, 25, to Puerto Suarez, 22. The last stage of the journey I covered astride one of the company's mules, hardly an improvement in comfort over walking on such a route. Luckily, the rains were delayed that year, or the difficulties of all this trans-Bolivian journey would have been quadrupled, and I might have been held for months in the hilltop hamlet of Santiago until the floods common to the 20 leagues or more west of the Paraguay subsided. Day after day we rode through the endless forest that crowded us close on either hand, with no other sign of humanity than the sulky mozo trotting behind me, sleeping in some tiny pascana where a moon so bright one could have read by it looked down upon the crosses of soldiers and travelers who had died on other journeys, or peered dully at me through the mesh of my mosquitero. Palmares, quagmires thick grown with hardy palm trees, in which we plunged to the saddle for long distances, alternated with thirsty stretches of waterless sand. In places the heavier woods gave way to dense brush, head high and always thorny. Across these, to the right, lay the vast Bolivian Chaco, or the Paraguayan, according to how the dispute shall finally be settled, in which the sun set so blood-red that the painter who dared to put half the reality on canvas would be accused of gross exaggeration. A strip of delicate pink sky blended quickly into the wet blue of the endless jungle. Darkness settled quickly down, and we rode noiselessly on, the sky an immense field of stars, bats circling around our heads and alighting again and again in the sandy road ahead to spring up with a peculiar little squeak when the mules' hooves had all but touched them. No other sound was heard except the chirping of the jungle, chiefly the long-drawn creak and short staccato of 2 species of crickets, and occasionally the noise of some wild animal fleeing unseen at our approach. On such a night we came to the Tucabaca, the only river of size between the Guape and the Paraguay. I ordered a halt until the moon appeared, but clouds hid it, and we came perilously close near losing a mule in forcing the frightened animals across. Frequently the Tucabaca rises in a few hours to a raging torrent that can only be crossed in a pelota, or in the dugout of a surly old Brazilian Negro living in a cluster of huts on the further bank. At Santa Ana, 18 waterless miles beyond, we were overtaken by 2 of the gringo colony of Santiago. Calling itself a city, the place is merely a row of thatched huts around a grass-grown space with a mud-hole to keep it alive, saintly in its customs as all the towns of this saintly route. Its corregidor takes orders not from the prefect of San Jose, but from the Delgado at Puerto Suarez, sent out from La Paz by way of Chile, Argentina, Paraguay, and Brazil. The place is a headquarters of Jejenes, and the wild Indians descend upon it periodically. At the very edge of the hamlet lies a barrizal, a mud-hole 3 miles long, famous for its victims. But beyond, territory which the year before had been almost unbroken lake was for long stretches without water to drink, though we wallowed in more than one swamp and slough. Near the corrals of Yacuces, in a low, humid region where rain often falls, we came upon telegraph poles, old and sagging, heavy with parasites and creepers. The line planned by the government from Puerto Suarez to Santa Cruz had been abandoned some 40 miles out, and cart drivers now cut down the poles and use the wire to repair their wagons. On the last morning we woke at 2 to find the moon brilliant, and pulling on our soggy garments, pushed eagerly forward. On the right, the Southern Cross stood forth brightly whenever a fleck of cloud veiled the moon. Away in the forest, monkeys wailed their everlasting plaint. Great masses of green vines covering irregular giant bushes looked like German castles in the moonlight. The first flush of day showed in the V-shaped opening ahead the shoulders of the advance horseman, cutting into the paling sky and blotting out the bright morning star. Then dawn came like thunder out of the endless wilderness, and somehow it seemed wasteful to keep the moon burning after the tropical sunshine had flooded all the scene. Tall, slender palms and all possible forms of trees, festooned and draped with vines in fantastic web and lace effects, stood out against the sky. Masses of pink morning glories quickly shrunk under the sun's glare. Brown moorhens, flicking their black tails saucily, foraged about mud-holes and flew clumsily like chickens with little half-jumps as we passed. Beyond the pascana of Tacuaral, with its myriad of slim tacuara palms, the country that should have been flooded at this season was utterly waterless. Hour after sun-baked hour we jogged on, our thirsty animals stumbling in the enormous sun-dried cart ruts. An occasional hut with a banana grove appeared in a tiny space shaved out of the bristling forest. In mid-afternoon we sighted through the heat rays ahead a wide street with red-tiled buildings and open water beyond, backed far away by low wooded ridges, and the port of Suarez and the end of Bolivia was at hand. It was 2 months to a day since Tommy and I had set out from Cochabamba. Dawn was just beginning to paint red the humid air between jungle and sky across the lagoon of Cáceres, a backwater of the river Paraguay, when I descended to its edge and by dint of acrobatic feats of equilibrium managed a bath and left behind in the mud and slime, like fallen heroes of many a campaign, the remnants of my tramping garb. As I climbed the bank new clad, there persisted the feeling that I had heartlessly abandoned some faithful friend of long standing. The gasoline launch chugged more than 2 hours across the muddy lagoa before there rose from the jungle, on a bit of knoll, the modern city of Corumbá in the Brazilian state of Mato Grosso, to the residents of which the appearance of a lone traveler from out the ferocious wilds and haunts of bugres beyond the lagoon that ends their world was little less wonder-provoking than the arrival of one from a distant planet. Here at last was civilization, expensive civilization, and steamers every few days to Ascension and Buenos Aires. End of Chapter 21. Skirting the Gran Chaco, Part 2. Chapter 22 of Vagabonding Down the Andes by Harry A. Franck. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Recording by Blainej, Victoria, British Columbia, Canada. Southward through Guarina land. With a deep blast from her ocean-going whistle, the Ascension of the Mihanovic line swung out through the shipping of a crowded port and was off down the Paraguay. The steamer was easily the equal of the best on the Hudson. Its officers and stewards, all Argentinos, were as white as you or I, though the passengers ran to all shades, and it was a little short of startling to see white waiters serving and kowtowing to haughty Brazilian half-Indians and Negroes. Green jungle, occasionally broken by prairie-like stretches, studded with dainty palm trees, like wheels of greenery on the ends of broomsticks, sped rapidly past. We stopped at several towns and estancias, now in Brazil, now in Paraguay. Here and there, a lone passenger standing erect in his boat was rowed out by a pair of peons and picked up as we slowed down for a moment. On the second morning, we halted at the estate of an Irishman on Brazilian soil. The passengers were going to inspect a jaguar and a huge wild cat in homemade cages, while cowboys roped a steer and, dragging it down to the edge of the bank to spare themselves the labor of carrying the carcass, slaughtered in plain sight of all what was served as beefsteak that noon and evening. Now and again we put in at a little Paraguayan town, swarming with barefoot boy soldiers in faded khaki, with a reputation for shooting on the slightest provocation. Old women came on board with bread, watermelons, and clumsy native cigars, scorning Brazilian money, and demanding the ragged and all but worthless bills of their own land. Here a new language appeared, the palatal Guarani sounding on all sides. The evening of the second day brought us to Villa Concepcion, one of the 6 incorporated cities of Paraguay, which might easily be mistaken for a village. An occasional estancia along the bank had a little railroad with screeching toy locomotives and an electric lighting plant of its own. The Paraguayan gaucho, or cowboy, had the independent air of men who will not be imposed upon. He wore a large straw hat, a colored kerchief about his neck. The chiripa, huge, baggy, cotton trousers with a puckering string about his bare ankles as a protection against the gnats and climbing insects, and in most cases a blacksmith's leather apron with a long fringe, a necessity for riders through the thorny undergrowth. Over this all wore a wide leather belt, with several buttoned pockets bulging with their probably not great wealth, and a big knife in a leather scabbard stuck in carelessly behind, as if ever ready to be drawn on the instant. On the morning of the 4th day I was awakened by a long blast of the whistle, and peered out of my hammock to find the steamer anchored among extensive docks. It was that soft moment of dawn when the sun is just trembling in stage fright below the eastern horizon, the lower sky streaked with delicate colors, the air of that velvety texture known only at such hours in the tropics. Then the day blazed forth in all its brilliancy, putting the night breeze to ignominious rout, and disclosing a low city, its chief square lined by 2-story buildings, the largest of which I recognized from photographs as Paraguay's government palace. One of a score of hirsute, piratical-looking boatmen, non-poetic names painted in gaudy colors on the poops of their crafts, rowed me ashore with a few strokes, and at the wooden steps of the custom-house answered my "How much?" with a "What it pleases you, señor." Either the boatmen of Ascension are unlike their tribe elsewhere, or my face had lost that innocent, childlike air of earlier days. I rewarded this honesty with 2 Paraguayan dollars, that is about 11 cents, and marching through my trunk-burdened fellow passengers, thrust my bundle toward a pompous cholo in a cream-colored suit. He peered through the slit in my deerskin Kodak cover, asked a question about the bundled developing tank, waved a hand with a regal-toned "Puede retirarse," "You may withdraw yourself," and I stepped ashore in Asunción del Paraguay. The capital of the inland republic is its only real city, claiming some 80,000 inhabitants, or 1/10 of the present population of a land that once, with nearly 2 millions, ranked with Brazil and the Argentine as the most important of South America. Today, thanks to revolutions, anarchy, Lopez and his French mistress, and the consequent stagnation, it is in the far background of modern progress. It spreads over a considerable space of what is really rolling ground, though to one fresh from nearly 2 years in the Andes it seemed monotonously flat. Across the river, on a curve of which it halts abruptly, lies the sea-flat, trackless Chaco, the abode of nomadic Indians, dense blue by day and fading to purple under the setting sun. Unfortunately, Francia, El Supremo, dictator for 1/3 of a century, sought to beautify the town by filling its lagoons, straightening its jumble of tortured lanes, and reducing it to a featureless similarity to all other capitals of its kind and size. Travelers of past centuries are agreed that the chief charm of old Ascension was due to its delightful irregularity. Certainly its ancient fascination is gone, and today it is nothing but a languid little capital of a stagnant country, the least interesting of any I had seen in South America. The time-worn assertion that the population of Paraguay is wholly Indian in blood is a decided overstatement. In Ascension one sees at least as many whites as in La Paz. Nor is it true that there are 9 women to every man. True, Francia wiped out the old Spaniards for conspiring against him. 40 years ago, in the days of Lopez, the wars reduced the proportion to 17-1. But time and migrating males have all but repaired these ravages. though many a man still lives on the exertions of his harem, one of the several women of which is his legal wife, and the majority of children born in the country are illegitimate. In general, the place has a different atmosphere, a blasé air little like the towns of the Andes. Among these less simple people, particularly the denizens of the Centro Español, where I was put up during my stay, one got the feeling that conventionality was not morality. There was something about their suave, well-bred manners that made one feel that deep down they were no such sticklers for honesty and justice as for the urbanities of life. Or would the artificiality of any civilized place have struck a discordant note to one coming suddenly out of a long stay in the wilderness? It is in Ascension that the traveler from the north notes the first advance of the immigration that is to increase to swamping proportions in the Argentine as he moves southward. Paraguay is making strenuous, though not very tactful, efforts to increase immigration, under an immigration bureau in the hands of a German. Commerce and government are largely in the hands of foreigners, at least of the second generation, even the president being a Swiss in blood and name. Paraguay's civilization is not strong enough to absorb the newcomers. One hears German, Italian, or Catalan almost as often as the native Guarani. This latter is the real speech of the country. Spanish is spoken only in the cities, and even there the people use among themselves the remnants of the aboriginal tongue. Teachers in large villages often cannot speak Castilian. The few Paraguayan countrymen who know it are afraid to use it, for fear their fellows will ridicule them for trying to show off. There has been more than one movement on foot to make Guarani the official, as well as the actual, language of the country. The money of Paraguay has fallen to low estate. Step into a bank and throw around an English sovereign, and there will be thrust upon you some $90 in the native currency, bringing the peso down to little more than the value of our nickel. Metal money is unknown. The paper bills made in London and New York are in universal use, the smaller denominations being ragged and dirty to the point of illegibility, and often patched with scraps of newspaper. The Nation, runs the device on these tattered billetes, recognizes this bill as 50 strong dollars, which is quite different from saying it will be redeemed at that rate. Streetcar fares, now 75, had been 67½ centavos, and the company had found it necessary to print its own change in 2½ centavo pieces, worth, well, let fractional experts figure it out. Eggs sold in the market at $7 a dozen. A haircut cost $5, and it was not a $5 haircut. On the other hand, postage is the cheapest on earth, evidently because the rates had been established and the stamps printed before the money had depreciated. After the first investigation, I put off replenishing my wardrobe until I should reach Buenos Aires. It was not merely because the tailor showed me shoddy stuff and demanded $350 for a suit of it. The local styles were even more startling than the price mentioned in so offhand a manner. The trousers demanded by custom, for example, be they made by a local tailor or imported from Europe, are built up as high as trousers could by any stretch of the word go. Then on top of this comes an enormous belt piece, so wide that it requires 3 buttons to fasten it, clamping the garment up about the armpits. If only they would use a couple inches more, they could button the trousers about the neck, fasten a collar on them, and dispense with the expense of a shirt entirely. In the olden days, it is said, the Inca tribes gave the inhabitants of this region the name of Guarani, breechless ones. The bloomer-like amplitude of the trousers of the countryman and the height of those of his city cousin suggests that they resent the implied insult keenly and have resolved to leave no opportunity for its repetition. Somewhere around this uncharted expanse of trouser, every one, from merchant to peon, wears a leather belt at least 6 inches wide, a combination of coin and revolver carryall, held together with several buckles of the size of those on a horse's saddle cinch. The international train leaves Ascension every Wednesday and Saturday morning, and lands the traveler in Montevideo or Buenos Aires 50 hours later. The through and local fares vary greatly, the former being subjected to the competition of the river steamers. First and second class rates to Buenos Aires are $450 and $325 respectively. Local fares are $680 and $460. Luckily, this is in Paraguayan currency, but even when turned into real money, it remains a respectable rate. For half a day we steamed across the broad pampas, almost prairies, backed by wooded ridges, isolated masses of dark rock standing forth here and there in the middle distance, dim outlines of low mountains hovering on the horizon. The broad savannas were speckled with cattle, somewhat gaunt, but of vastly better stock than those of the Andes. A bulky china bowl here and there explained the improvement. Every man on the train was armed, the weapons varying from flintlock, muzzle-loading horse pistols, to the very latest automatic. The revolver is a sign of caste in Paraguay. My companions accepted me as one of them only when I had shown my own. When the conductor came through for tickets, his friends and acquaintances playfully pointed their weapons at him. The faces of many, even youthful men, were scarred from the latest revolution, like the battered facades of Ascension. Every native aboard, women, children, the train crew, even the train guard in his white uniform and helmet, smoked big black cigars, which are really nothing more than the blackened natural leaf rolled up in cigar form. Brown maidens, physically not unattractive, sat with a half-smoked stogie in a corner of their mouths, and now and then spat through their teeth like New York toughs. The cigarette, all but universal elsewhere on my journey, finds slight favor in Paraguay. At the stations, peons in baggy chiripas mingled with estancieros, their neck-high trousers tucked into soft leather boots, a silver-headed rebenque, or short riding whip, hanging from their wrists by a leather thong. Women squatted on the brick flaggings, selling anything from raw beefsteaks to the native firewater. Though there were many stations, the towns were rarely visible, except a single church tower marking the site some distance off. Being built on knolls, the expense of entering them has been avoided by the railway constructors. The few that were seen were triste at best, the populations lolling about the openings that served as doors, ragged and ambitionless. At Loquis station, women wearing from 10 to 50 coarse straw hats each languidly offered them for sale. At Patiño, a crude tramway was waiting to carry to the bank of the river the passengers for San Bernardino, Paraguay's watering place on the beautiful freshwater lake of Ypacaray. Then came Paraguari, famous for its revolutions, commercial center of all the old missions for 100 miles around, leaf-roofed, two-wheel carts awaiting freight or passengers. 75 miles from the capital, we skirted Villarrica, second city of the inland republic, with a commerce in tobacco, sugar, and lumber, but a mere village in all but name. At the small prairie station of Borja, from which some fellow countrymen were constructing a branch line someday to reach the Iguazu Falls, I abandoned the International and was soon speeding away across the flat country in a track automobile. At best, the Paraguayan landscape is monotonous. Vast plains of reddish soil and coarse grass stretch away until lost to view, here and there broken by thick clumps of forest. Ever and again we were slowed down or halted by reddish, half-wild cattle on the unfenced track. The pampa was sprinkled with them as far as the eye could see. The plains either are, or are fancied to be, of no value for agriculture, and are left to grazing, while the languid natives, swinging in their hammocks under their wall-less roofs in the edges of the forest clumps, raised a bit of corn and tobacco in plantations hacked out of the woods, and trusted Providence for the rest. Ponderous, springless, two-wheeled ox carts that seemed all wheels labored by. Everywhere the taqueru, or cone-shaped anthills, stood head-high in the tall grass. My companions told of tacarus erected during a single night in the middle of earth-floored dwellings and requiring the exertions of a band of workmen to dig them out. At length we drew up before the rough board headquarters at Guarina. It being Saturday evening, the entire region, men, women, and children, proposed to ride into Borja on the work train, to squander their month's wages and remain several days drunk. The young American superintendent, however, issued orders to the Paraguayan soldiers that had been assigned him, and though these looking anything but fierce in their ragged khaki and bare feet, the throng lost no time in obeying their orders to disembark. For all their childlike demeanor, the soldiers of Paraguay have a reputation for shooting on scant provocation. We pushed on along battered old rails, through forest and jungle, with here and there a bank of red clay, some 10 miles to railhead, the line squirming its way around every knoll, the cheap engines to be employed requiring that there be nothing steeper than a 1% grade. Advanced gangs had hacked out a cart road for some distance beyond, where the territory was growing so dense wooded and hilly that the superintendent was considering the use of balloons to survey the country. Back at the main camp I had my first mate, or Paraguayan tea. The yerba mate is to the life of Paraguay and its adjoining regions what cocoa leaves are to the Andes. In the yerbales, the leaves and smaller branches of an evergreen bush, not unlike the holly, growing among taller trees, are spread on a raised platform of poles, smoked and dried, forced through to the earth floor beneath, beaten almost to a powder with clubs, and packed in tercios by sewing up green ox hides, which shrink until the contents is stone hard. The gringo engineers had come to prefer this native beverage to coffee or tea, though they drank it in cups with sugar and milk. The native way is to put a spoonful of the powdered yerba in a little pear-shaped gourd, pour this full of boiling water, and suck the tea through a brass or silver tube, or in the case of the poorer people, a reed. 1 spoonful suffices for a score of persons, the gourd being passed from one to another of a group, each time being refilled with water, the drinker taking care not to burn hands or lips on gourd or tube. To any but a foreigner it would be an insult to offer a separate bowl. The greenish liquid was bitter in taste and by no means pleasant, but was due in time to become my favorite beverage, as it does with most gringos who continue the use of it. Everywhere in this region one runs upon natives loafing in the shade, a mate gourd, sometimes carved with fantastic figures, grasped in one hand, lazily imbibing the liquid at regular intervals. Unlike the coca, it has no narcotic effect. It is, on the contrary, beneficial in stomachic ailments. The gaucho of the pampas makes it serve as bread and vegetables in his fixed diet of asado con cuero, or beef roasted on the hide. Many an attempt has been made to introduce mate to the rest of the world, so far, unfortunately, in vain. I fell asleep toward dawn on a cot set out in the breeze, to the rattle of poker chips, the clinking of bottles and glasses, and cries of $100, $250 from the office in which the gringo community had gathered. Next evening, a local train set me down in the heavy darkness at Villa Encarnacion. Up to a few months before, the halting place for the night of the International. In name one of the 6 cities of Paraguay, the place was a drowsy, barefoot, isolated cluster of buildings rather than a town. Strewn along the side of a red hill, amid half-luxuriant vegetation, on the banks of the Paraná, the southern boundary of Paraguay, it covered a considerable space of rolling grassy ground, with wide paths of reddish sand where streets should have been. Its slight commerce was chiefly in the hands of Germans. It was humid with the rainy season and insolent with its big, ragged garrison. Green parrots screamed in and out of the orange groves, the fruit of which was green in color even when ripe, and of rather acid taste. Across the Paraná, as wide as the Hudson, Posadas in the Argentine lay banked up on the sloping opposite shore, in plain sight from any part of the town. Life is free and easy in Paraguay, close to nature. Its women, in their loose gowns and bare feet, very erect from the practice of carrying loads on their heads from childhood, have a childlike simplicity, as well as an extremely graceful carriage. Yet I found this the least interesting of South American countries. Its old missions, to the ruined churches of which, overgrown with creepers, a ride of a day or two from the railroad at almost any point brings one, attract many travelers. But I had already seen these and better in tropical Bolivia. With its education at low ebb, chiefly in the hands of priests to whom sacred history and catechisms are the sum total of wisdom, the present inhabitants of Paraguay leave the impression of being incapable of much advancement. The change from this languid little country to the live ones across the river was almost startling. When the sun had declined somewhat, a motorboat chugged across to Posadas with a score of passengers, where we landed without ceremony among a group of Argentine officials, well-dressed and courteously businesslike. To those coming upon it from the direction of Buenos Aires, Posadas may seem small and backward. In contrast with the drowsy little grass-grown Paraguayan city, still in plain sight across the Paraná, it is very much alive. The capital of the territory of Misiones, that tongue of land piercing far up between Brazil and Paraguay, and taking its name from the Jesuit establishments of olden times, it already boasts some 10,000 inhabitants, or more than the entire territory contained 10 years ago. In spite of being tolerably compact and two-storied in the business section, the town covers a vast amount of ground, with very wide streets and ample elbow room everywhere, except in the clustered shacks of laborers along the river brink. A single church, its old red brick tower still unfinished, rather Protestant than Catholic in appearance, by reason of the simplicity of its adornments and the existence of seats within, takes the place of the score or more that would bulk up above a town of similar size in the Andes. Here were hard-paved streets instead of sand-holes, steamrollers and up-to-date machinery, business activity and shoes, well-kept parks with plenty of benches, large prominent buildings as schools, just opening for the new year in this first week in March, and well-dressed policemen of manly demeanor. Canvas cots had taken the place of hammocks. Boys were busy polishing brass nameplates before important business houses. The red Liberty cap now adorned all government shields, while the most beautiful flag of South America, the Argentinian, white and sky blue, flew at the crest of many a facade. Here a stranger could pass in the streets without being stared out of countenance. The inhabitants had a look of eagerness and hope in their faces, signs of at least a material prosperity in striking contrast to the dreary hopelessness of Andean regions. Yet Posadas is not 40 years old, while Encarnacion, across the river, was founded by the Jesuits more than 3 centuries ago. In the second-class car of the NEA, the Nord-Este Argentino, there were no Indian passengers, and though only a mixto, the train made good progress. At the very first farm outside Posadas, an American binder was felling the autumn grain. I had not seen so much as a mower since crossing the Rio Grande 30 months before. At every station were uniformed police. Mounted officers patrolled the country roads. Houses along the way were not the dens of human animals, but were supplied with the comforts of home, even American rocking chairs tucked away in the shade of their verandas. I had come to the end of the great South American monte and jungle, and from now on the great Argentine pampas grew ever broader, slightly rolling here, stretching away to infinity on each hand. The brick-red soil of Misiones was given over to grazing rather than to agriculture. Though we passed long autumn-dry cornfields, the ears broken half off and hanging over to ripen. Cattle were everywhere, and cowboys were roping them here and there, while gauchos careered across the broad plains on their hardy pintos. The railroad and all its appurtenances were just as orderly as they would have been in England, the railway architecture of which it resembled, though the cars were of the American style. Everything from engine to yards was so English one felt sure that, had they spoken their language, the train crews would have called the little four-wheeled freight cars goods vans and spoken of metals and sleepers. It was some time after dark that we pulled into Santo Tomé, or at least into a station bearing that name, and I concluded that I had ridden far enough for the time being. The train did not enter the town, perhaps because it would have been hard to decide just where the town was. In the Argentine, these are scattered over a vast amount of ground, in striking contrast to the heaped-up crowding common to the Andes. A half-moon dim-lighted the flat country far and wide. I set out in the moonlight along a broad highway, and wandered until any hope of finding a town died out, then ran upon a few low, scattered houses that suggested some insignificant village, like Bolivia's tropical cities. Then I went on and on, until there grew up about me an immense town, never crowded together, yet with an enormous plaza, long stretches of electric arc lamps, and checkerboard city of wide streets and long blocks, each house set in its own big garden, a town well-to-do, citified, with many automobiles, and but a single church, of moderate size and inconspicuous. Life began to renew about the station at 3 a.m. The restaurant opened, watchmen lighted big gasoline arc lamps, the International rolled in, and we were off again, with ample room even in the second-class car. 3 hours later I sat up to watch the sunrise red out of Uruguay across the river. About the vast, long-haired, unkempt plains stood clumps of pampa trees. At the towns were many gay with blossoms, spring blossoms I had almost written, until I remembered it was autumn. The aloncita, a bird not unlike a small robin in appearance, though with less red, began to build its beehive-shaped mud nest on the wooden crosspieces of the telegraph poles. All day long, for hundreds of miles, there was an average of a nest on every third pole, always on the side furthest from the railroad, as if the noise of the trains were annoying to its inhabitants. The arched doorway always toward the direction from which we came, the north, to catch, perhaps, the warmer breezes. Among hundreds of nests, I saw only 3 or 4 exceptions to this, and all day long only one built anywhere else than on the crosspiece, close against the pole. One daring architect had set his on top of the pole itself, neatly capping it. As this particular pole had its crosspiece already occupied, it looked as if the bird above was a hard-headed fellow who had failed to stake his claim in time, but who insisted, nevertheless, on living in that particular spot. The country grew more and more like our own, in climate, creature comforts, newsstands, block signals, uniformed mailmen, carts and wagons, some of them of the boat-shaped style of Poland, rattling past on broad highways, busy towns along the way, at only the more important of which the train halted briefly, and between them raced swiftly and smoothly southward. Through the windows the horizon of the great rolling pampa continually rose and fell. Sometimes it was punctuated with a grove of trees, more rarely with a small forest, the chiefly unfenced plains everywhere sprinkled with cattle. Here and there, a ñandu, the South American ostrich, trotted awkwardly away across the prairie. Where there were fences, the wires ran through the posts by holes bored in them rather than being secured by staples. Well-tended fields of fruit trees in long rows seemed incongruous in South America. It brought a feeling of satisfaction to see industry and decent living again, things being done, instead of merely doing themselves. Some industrious country boys climbed a fence with bags of large, juicy watermelons for sale. boys merely in quest of pocket money and not because their livelihood depended upon it. The population at large was too busy to bother with station hawking. Countrymen wore bombachos, enormous bloomer-like trousers tucked into soft-top boots or drawn up about the bare ankles above their alpargatas or hempen soles, as if the cost of cloth were of no importance. Any lady would have remained ladylike in them. Now and then the river drew up so close beside us that we could look far off across Uruguay, spread out on the other side. At length we sighted ahead, a sort of oriental mist hovering about it, a whitish city with a two-tower church suggesting minarets, a city set on a knoll, not unlike Jerusalem. Yet this was not the town we were approaching, but Salto, in the República Oriental, over the river. Great fields of grapes, well tended, began to race past us. Suburban houses thickened, and we drew up at the in all respects complete city of Concordia, 400 miles south of Posadas, on the frontier I had left 24 hours before. In the Andes, world-famous cities had been mere languid villages. In the Argentine, places the world at large had never heard of were large, flourishing metropolises. Concordia numbers 20,000 inhabitants, virtually all white and all alive. Yet it is not even the capital, but merely the second city of the province of the Entre Rios, between the rivers, Paraná and Uruguay, famous for its saladerias, or beef salting establishments. Well spread out, it has few churches and no oversupply of priests. The former with few bells and those of agreeable tone, which are rung not too often instead of being beaten with an infernal din. Liquor shops are few. The majority of the population finds something more worthwhile than shopkeeping. Its inhabitants know how to pass two abreast on the sidewalks. Women on bicycles bring a frequent start of surprise. Swarms of cleanly dressed boys and girls sally forth from big, well-equipped schools, where coeducation reigns. Bootblacks, clad like businessmen and carrying upholstered and decorated seats, seek their clients in the well-kept streets and plazas. Electric streetcars give excellent service. Electric lights, both in streets and houses, were even more brilliant than our own. The public library was actually open and functioning, and did not spend its time staring at the foreigner who had come to read. In the Hotel Garibaldi, just such a place as the name implies, wine was served with meals as freely as in Europe, and though only the abode of working men, it was superior to the best hostelry of Andean cities. Real beds had now taken the place of canvas cots. At the rear was an electric-lighted cancha de bochas, an outdoor bowling alley for the clientele of Italian workmen. I slipped across the river next afternoon to Salto in Uruguay, adding another country to my growing collection. One went and came freely without frontier formalities. Salto is large and several times older than Concordia, with many well-built buildings, yet with a suggestion of seediness, a bit more squalor and barefootedness. Its church not so imposing and well kept as it looks at a distance, its policemen in rather shiny and threadbare uniforms, its streets cobbled rather than smoothly paved. In short, it is more Spanish in type, more clustered together, with a general air suggesting that this is not quite so live and hopeful a country as that over the river. Many proud old families live here, yet the head of more than one of them slips across daily to do business in the Argentine. One can go from Concordia to Buenos Aires by rail, but I chose to take the overnight journey on a big Mahanovich river steamer, with all the conveniences of an ocean liner. The flat, sometimes rolling, occasionally bushy shores of Uruguay were broken by several towns, notably the two model establishments producing Liebig's extract of beef. When I returned on deck next morning, a brilliant sun was pouring its rays blindingly over the stream misnamed the Plata, the River of Silver, by Sebastian Gaboto, who was none other than our own Sebastian Cabot, because he fancied it ran uphill to the silver mines of Peru. The Indians called it the Paraná Guazú, the river as large as a sea, a truer name, for on the right it stretched away to the dimmest of broken landforms, and soon these too disappeared, and a reddish-brown sea spread unbroken to the horizon. For a time we hugged the Uruguayan shore, then swung the blazing sun around behind us and struck out for what, but for its color, might have been the open sea. Soon we began to pass buoys of the Argentine government, marked RAMOP, with the kilometers to the end of my journey painted upon them. Toward 8, where the yellow sea and the bluish-gray sky met, the vast, perfect circle of the horizon was broken by a patch of faint white. It was only a tiny narrow line down at the extreme edge of the great inverted bowl of the sky above us, yet so long, several inches in fact, that it should turn out to be a city, as I began to suspect, since we were headed directly for it. It would be a large one indeed. Then the white patch began to take on faint individual shape, and above us the wireless was spitting its message to the yet invisible world ahead. An hour later, we were in the midst of buoys, large and small, marking the Canal Zone, or South Channel. Boats and steamers appeared, and sailing vessels spread their white wings across the yellow waters on all sides of us, while the city, stretched along the horizon ahead, had turned from white to gray, with a hint of red, neither color nor edifice conspicuous, except for two groups of large brick smokestacks belching forth into the brilliant sky. Even after the long line of buildings had taken on definite form, and one could all but count their windows, the city seemed still to sit on the yellow sea. One was struck, too, by the narrowness of the strip. The buildings seemed for the most part a bare 4 stories, with only here and there one as high as 10 cutting into the landless skyline. 2 tugs took possession of us, dragging us up a narrow channel through a wilderness of shipping, where we must soon stop for lack of space, until we spied an unoccupied bit of wharf, and warped gradually into it. It was a late summer morning, the 9th of March. While the rest waited for their baggage to be examined, an official glanced at my bundle, jerked a thumb scornfully over a shoulder, and I stepped into the metropolitan rumble of, no wonder gringo residents have abbreviated it to BA, La Ciudad y Puerto de Santa Maria de los Buenos Aires. The end. End of Southward through Guarina land. End of Vagabonding Down the Andes by Harry A. Franck.